Welcome back, everyone. Pull your blanket a little closer, get comfortable and settle in, because tonight we're going to take a journey 2,000 years into the past. And I promise you, what you find there is going to surprise you. Imagine this. You're one of the wealthiest people in the most powerful city on earth. You own a magnificent home with hand-painted walls, marble floors, and a private garden that your neighbours would absolutely envy. You have dozens of servants who anticipate your every need. You wear robes dyed in colours so rare that even kings in distant lands cannot afford them. Poets write verses in your honour. Generals send you gifts from conquered lands. By every measure of your world you have made it. And yet you have never once taken a hot shower alone in your life. You have never slept in a room that was truly completely silent. You have never drunk a glass of water without unknowingly swallowing traces of lead. And the bedroom where you close your eyes every night, it is smaller than most modern walk-in closets. Welcome to luxury Roman style. Here is what I find endlessly fascinating about ancient Rome. And honestly, it is what pulled me down this particular rabbit hole in the first place. We've all seen the movies. We've all seen the grand marble columns, the flowing white togas, the feasts that stretch on endlessly, the emperors lounging on golden thrones. Hollywood has done a remarkable job making ancient Rome look like a five-star resort that just happens to also have gladiators. But the deeper you go into the actual historical record, the letters of Cicero, the observations of Pliny the Elder, the satirical poems of Juvenal, the archaeology preserved beneath the volcanic ash of Pompeii, the more you realize that the Roman idea of luxury was built on a completely different foundation than ours. Not worse, not better in every respect, but genuinely profoundly different in ways that reveal something important about what human beings truly value when they have the power to choose. So tonight, in this first part of our journey, I want to lay the groundwork. I want to gently dismantle the golden image and show you what actually lay beneath the marble surface of Roman wealth. Because understanding the gap between perception and reality is the key to understanding everything else we're going to explore together. Let us start with something so fundamental that it seems almost too obvious to mention: privacy. The concept we take so completely for granted today that most of us have never even thought to be grateful for it. In ancient Rome, privacy as we understand it today simply did not exist in the way we expect it, not even for the rich. The home of a wealthy Roman senator, the domus, that beautiful sprawling townhouse we so often see reconstructed in documentaries, was not a private sanctuary in the modern sense. It was in many ways a performance space. The atrium, the grand entrance hall, was designed specifically to receive visitors, and not just the guests you invited. Every morning a wealthy Roman was expected to hold what was called the salutatio, a morning audience where clients, business associates, political allies and favour seekers would line up and file through your home to pay their respects. Think about that for a moment. Imagine waking up every single morning and before you have even had your breakfast, which for the Romans was typically just bread dipped in olive oil, sometimes with a handful of olives or a few figs. Before any of that, you're already in a semi-public performance greeting a stream of people who need things from you. Your home is not where you escape the world. Your home is where the world comes to find you. The historian Carcopino, in his landmark work on Roman daily life, described the Roman domus as a house that faced inward its windows, looking toward the inner garden rather than the street, and yet it was never truly sealed off from the public gaze. The boundary between private life and public obligation was almost non-existent by our standards. Now, if you were not wealthy, and the vast majority of Romans were not, the situation was considerably more crowded. Most of the 1 million or so people who lived in the city of Rome during its imperial peak lived not in those beautiful townhouses, but in buildings called insulae. apartment buildings, and I use that term very loosely. These were multi-story structures, sometimes reaching 6 or 7 floors, crammed together along the winding streets of the city. The ground floor units went to those who could afford slightly better conditions. The higher you climbed, the poorer the residents and the more dangerous the situation. Upper floors had no running water, no heating, beyond small portable braziers that were a constant fire hazard, no cooking facilities in many cases, and no sewage connection. When a family on the 5th floor needed to deal with the waste, they had 2 options. They could carry it down to the street-level communal latrine, and this was apparently common enough that writers like Juvenal complained bitterly about it, they could simply empty it out the window into the street below. And yet here is the thing that genuinely amazes me every time I think about it. Even the ground floor of an insula, the best unit in the building, was considered a step up from sleeping rough. Having a door to close even without running water, even sharing walls with 20 other families, even smelling the street life of ancient Rome, drifting through your shutterless windows, that was still an improvement over nothing. That was still in a sense a form of prosperity. The Romans lived on an entirely different spectrum of what comfort meant. Let us talk about water, because this is where the gap between Roman luxury and modern expectations becomes almost comical. Rome was without question an engineering marvel when it came to water. The city had 11 aqueducts by the height of the empire together, capable of delivering roughly 1 billion litres of fresh water into the city every single day. That is an extraordinary achievement. The Romans were rightfully proud of it, and writers like Pliny the Elder marvelled at this network of channels as one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. But here is what that water actually meant in practice for most people. The aqueducts fed first into the public fountains scattered throughout the city, then into the public baths, then into the homes of a privileged few who had paid handsomely for the privilege of a private connection. For the overwhelming majority of Roman citizens, getting water meant walking to the nearest public fountain with a jug or a pot, filling it and carrying it home. Every single day. Multiple times a day if your family was large. In a city of 1 million people. Up multiple flights of stairs if you lived in an insula. And the pipes that carried water to those lucky few wealthy homes made of lead. Pure lead. The Latin word for lead, by the way, is plumbum, which is exactly where our word plumbing comes from. Researchers analysing sediment samples near ancient Roman harbour sites have found that lead concentration in the water supply was approximately 10 times higher than what we would consider safe by modern standards. The Romans were essentially drinking slowly poisoned water and calling it a luxury. They had no way of knowing, of course. Lead poisoning is insidious precisely because it works so quietly over years and generations. But it is one of those historical details that stops you cold when you really sit with it. This symbol of Roman wealth, private running water piped directly into your home, was literally a slow-acting poison disguised as privilege. I think what strikes me most whenever I go deep into the primary sources on Roman daily life is how the Romans themselves seem to understand on some level that their idea of luxury was precarious. The philosopher Seneca, who was one of the wealthiest men in Rome during the reign of the Emperor Nero, wrote extensively and almost anxiously about the emptiness of material comfort. He lived in a home of extraordinary opulence, and yet wrote letter after letter to his friend Lucilius, warning against the seductions of luxury. "It is not the man who has too little who is poor," Seneca wrote, "but the man who hankers after more." And Seneca was not writing from some comfortable philosophical distance. He was writing from inside the contradiction, from within a life of marble floors and silver dining sets, knowing full well that the water in those silver cups came through lead pipes, that the servants who brought those cups to his lips were human beings who could be bought and sold, that the entire gilded structure of Roman prosperity rested on a foundation of inequality so vast it would have been simply incomprehensible to most of the people living within it. That tension between the gleaming surface of Roman civilization and the complicated reality underneath is what we're going to spend the next several hours exploring together. Because here is the real question that I keep coming back to, and I want you to hold this question with you as we move through this series. What does luxury actually mean? Is it about having things, about being separated from discomfort, about freedom from need, about status in the eyes of others? The Romans had very specific answers to these questions, and those answers were shaped by the technology they had, the social structures they lived within, the values they inherited from centuries of Roman culture, and the very real, very physical constraints of life in the ancient world. A wealthy Roman senator in the 1st century of the Common Era would have considered himself among the most fortunate humans who'd ever lived. He would have been absolutely correct by the standards of his world, and yet by ours his daily existence would feel in many ways remarkably uncomfortable. Not primitive, not barbaric, but genuinely different in ways that reveal how much of what we consider essential comfort is actually quite recent, quite fragile, and quite contingent on a series of inventions that most of us never even think about. The hot shower, the private toilet, the sealed window, the controlled temperature, the silent room, the clean glass of water. These are the true luxuries of the modern age, and not one of them existed in ancient Rome. In the parts that follow, we're going to go much deeper into this story. We will sit down at Roman feast and discover that the most prestigious ingredients on the table were things that would clear out a modern restaurant in seconds. We will step into the public baths, that great social equalizer, and find out that the cleansing ritual of Roman luxury involved neither soap nor privacy, nor often clean water. We will look at the stunning divide between the homes of the wealthy and the apartments of everyone else, and meet the man who got extraordinarily rich by letting those apartments burn down. We will explore what Roman clothing, Roman entertainment, Roman medicine, and Roman ideas about money truly looked like when you strip away the Hollywood gloss. But for now, let us just sit with this image. A wealthy Roman at the end of a long day climbing into his narrow bed in his small lamplit cubiculum, the sounds of the city drifting through the walls, the neighbours arguing the cartwheels on the stone pavement, outside the distant call of a street vendor, closing his eyes and believing with genuine conviction that he had everything a man could want. He was not wrong. He was just living in a different world, with a different definition of everything. And that, I think, is where the real story begins. So, now that we have pulled back the curtain on the grand illusion of Roman luxury, and taken a hard look at what really lay beneath all that marble and golden light, let us pull up a chair. Or rather, let us lie down on one, because that is actually how the Romans ate. And trust me, by the time this part is over, you are going to be looking at your dinner very differently. Food is one of those things that feels timeless. We eat, they ate. Simple. But the moment you start digging into what the Romans considered a truly prestigious meal, what they served when they wanted to impress, when they wanted to signal to the room that they had arrived, that they were the kind of person worth knowing, you realize that taste, prestige, and the very idea of culinary luxury are not timeless at all. They are deeply, surprisingly historical, and nowhere is that more clear than on the ancient Roman dinner table. Let us start with the smell. Because before you even sat down at a Roman feast, before the first dish had been carried in on its silver platter, before you had reclined on your triclinium couch and adjusted your toga into something resembling comfortable, there would have been a smell in the air. Warm, fermented, deeply savoury. pungent in a way that would make most modern noses wrinkle. That smell was garum. Garum was without any exaggeration the most beloved condiment in the entire Roman world. It appeared in nearly 350 of the recipes collected in the ancient cookbook, attributed to the gourmand Marcus Gavius Apicius. It was drizzled on meat, stirred into stews, mixed with wine, blended with honey, used as medicine for ailing soldiers, and poured over vegetables the way we might reach for olive oil or soy sauce today. To the Romans, garum was as natural and as essential as salt itself. In fact, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, who had an opinion on absolutely everything, described the finest premium garum as having an aroma comparable to the most exquisite perfume. Here is what garum actually was. Whole fish intestines, the guts, specifically the parts that the fishermen would otherwise throw away, were packed between thick layers of sea salt in great open stone vats along the Mediterranean coast. Then they were left in the sun for months. 2, sometimes 3 months of slow fermentation under the Mediterranean heat, until the whole mixture had broken down into a dark, intensely concentrated liquid that was strained off and bottled in clay amphorae for shipping across the empire. Now, the factories that made garum were deliberately built outside city centres, not for scenic reasons, because the smell during production was by all accounts absolutely extraordinary in the worst possible way. Seneca, in one of his letters, described garum with barely disguised disgust as the overpriced guts of rotten fish that burn up the stomach with salted putrefaction. And Seneca ate it regularly. The Romans all did. Here is the thing that fascinates me about garum. When food historians and modern chefs have actually reconstructed it, and several Michelin-starred chefs in Spain have done exactly this in recent years, working from ancient factory sites near what is now Cadiz, what they found was that garum is not unpleasant at all. It is intensely umami. Rich savoury, layered in a way that is deeply reminiscent of the fish sauces used throughout Southeast Asia today. The best garum made carefully from quality fish, with precise fermentation, was genuinely extraordinary. One modern chef who tasted a reconstruction of the premium product described it as the umami of the Mediterranean. So here is a question worth sitting with. Were the Romans wrong about garum being a luxury item, or have we simply lost the ability to appreciate what they were tasting? But garum was just the beginning. The invitation you really wanted, the one that meant you had truly arrived in Roman social life, was to a cena, an evening dinner party, hosted by someone wealthy enough to make a statement with their table. And the statement they wanted to make was this: I have access to things you cannot imagine. The cookbook of Apicius gives us the most detailed surviving window into what those statements actually looked like. And it is genuinely one of the strangest documents I have ever read with genuine pleasure. Let us work our way through a meal. The first courses, the gustatio, the appetizers, might include eggs, which sounds perfectly ordinary, until you discover they were likely hard-boiled and served swimming in garum, or else prepared with pine nuts and fermented fish paste as a stuffing. There would be olives, perfectly reasonable. There might be sea urchin custard, the spiny contents of the urchin blended with eggs, sweet wine and fish sauce then cooked gently in the shell. Moving into the main courses, the cena proper, the wealthy Roman host had several options for demonstrating their social standing. One was rarity. Not rarity in the sense of truffles or aged wine, which were also present, but rarity in the sense of serving animals that most people had simply never eaten, and never would. Peacock was considered among the finest of all Roman luxury foods. Apicius places it at the very top of the meat hierarchy, above pheasant, above rabbit, above chicken, above pork. The bird would have been killed for a feast, plucked, cooked, and then in a move that must have been genuinely theatrical, reassembled with its magnificent tail feathers reattached for presentation. The Romans were not merely eating the food, They were staging it. Then there were dormice. The edible dormouse, a small, round, extraordinarily sleepy rodent that the Romans fattened specifically for the table in specialized clay pots called gliraria, was roasted whole and stuffed with minced pork pine nuts and pepper. The Romans apparently liked them so much that they brought the practice of eating dormice with them when they conquered Britain. Can you imagine the Romans arrive with their legions, their aqueducts, their road-building equipment, and their dormouse fattening pots? And then there were the flamingo tongues. Pliny the Elder wrote that it was the Roman epicure Apicius himself who first popularized the idea that the flamingo's tongue was an especially fine delicacy. Multiple flamingos had to die for a single serving. The tongues were typically boiled with dates, wine, pepper, and vinegar. Food historians are largely in agreement that the tongues were served less because of how they tasted, and more because of what they communicated, that you had the resources to slaughter multiple exotic imported birds for an ingredient that could fit in a small bowl. This is the crucial insight about Roman luxury dining that I think people miss when they see these lists of bizarre ingredients. The point was never purely gastronomic. The point was legibility. Can the people around this table see, taste, and understand immediately that I have power connections and wealth beyond the ordinary? A roasted dormouse tells that story. A platter of flamingo tongues screams it. There is another dimension to this that deserves a moment. We should talk about how they actually ate. The Romans reclined to dine. The triclinium, literally 3 couches, was the standard arrangement for a Roman dinner party. 3 large couches positioned in a U shape around a central table, and the guests would lie on their left sides propped on an elbow, eating with their right hand. Free hand, no fork. Forks did not exist as eating implements in ancient Rome. You used your fingers, you used bread to scoop, and slaves with small basins of water circulated through the rooms you could rinse between courses. Eating in this position for hours at a stretch is actually quite difficult, by the way. Your core engages your shoulder tires, and the Roman doctors of the era apparently had a lot to say about the digestive implications of eating while lying down. Galen, the preeminent physician of the 2nd century, wrote extensively about digestion, and was deeply skeptical of the Roman habit of eating so many courses in such a reclined position. He was probably right. And those courses. The Roman feast was not a meal in the modern sense of a main dish with sides. It was a progression of experiences sometimes lasting well into the night, with entertainment woven throughout. Musicians, dancers recited poetry, philosophical debate. Petronius, in his satirical novel, gives us a famous fictional feast hosted by a character called Trimalchio, a former slave turned fabulously wealthy freeman who serves dishes so absurdly theatrical that they are meant to be read as comic. A whole roasted pig that, when cut open, releases a cascade of cooked sausages. A zodiac-themed appetizer course with a different delicacy for each astrological sign. A dessert made to look like a bird's nest complete with edible eggs. Whether or not Petronius was exaggerating, and he almost certainly was for comic effect, the fact that his Roman audience would have recognized this as a plausible excess tells us something important about the culture. The feast was performance. The food was costume. One more thing before we move on, because I think it changes how you see all of this. For the vast majority of Romans, the people filling the streets, and the insulae we discussed before, the Roman diet was not garum and peacock. It was grain porridge called pulse, coarse bread, dried legumes, and occasionally a small piece of salted fish. Meat was a rare luxury. Fresh vegetables depended on the season. The street food vendors, called thermopolia, offered hot lentils, spiced wine, and baked cheese to people who had no cooking facilities in their apartments. The chasm between what the wealthy ate at a cena and what an ordinary Roman ate on a Tuesday was almost incomprehensibly wide. Wider arguably than anything we see in the modern developed world. So when we look at flamingo tongues and dormice and multi-hour theatrical feasts, we are not looking at what Roman people ate. We are looking at what Roman power looked like when it sat down to dinner, and power in every era has always had its own peculiar appetite. Speaking of things that might surprise you, just wait until we step away from the table and follow our wealthy Roman host to his next daily ritual. Because after the feast comes the bath, and the Roman bath was a place so socially complex, so physically intense, and so fundamentally different from anything we would recognize as relaxation today, that it deserves its own full story. That story's coming up right now. Right, we have eaten. We have survived the flamingo tongues and made peace with the garum. Now, in the rhythm of a typical Roman afternoon, there is one more essential stop before the evening really begins. And honestly, of everything we're going to explore in this series, this next chapter might be the one that surprises people the most because it involves something we consider deeply, almost fiercely private. The bath. Not your bath. Not a quiet 20 minutes alone with a candle and something to read on your phone. The Roman bath was one of the loudest, most crowded, most socially layered experiences a person could have in the ancient world, and it was considered one of the greatest luxuries civilization had to offer. Let that tension sit for a moment before we dive in. Picture the city of Rome at its height somewhere around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, when the population had swelled to over 1 million people, and the empire stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the grey skies of northern Britain. By this point, the city of Rome alone had an astonishing 952 recorded public bathhouses. Not 9, not 90, 952. Some were small neighbourhood establishments called balneum, the kind of place where a local tradesman might stop in after work, pay a fraction of a day's wage at the door, and spend an hour sweating and gossiping with his neighbours. Others were the vast imperial Thermae monuments of engineering and marble so enormous that they still leave archaeologists genuinely awed 2,000 years later. The baths of Caracalla, completed between the years 212 and 216 of the Common Era, could accommodate 1,600 bathers simultaneously. On a busy day, up to 8,000 people passed through its doors. The complex covered roughly 62 acres. It contained a cold swimming pool, a warm room, a hot steam room, 2 libraries, one in Latin, one in Greek, formal gardens, a gymnasium for wrestling and weightlifting, and over 120 major sculptures decorating the interior walls. The famous Farnese Hercules, one of the most celebrated sculptures of the ancient world, was found right there in the ruins of the baths. Think about what that means for a moment. You went to bathe, and while you waited for a room to open up, you could read in the library, walk through sculpted gardens, watch men wrestling in the courtyard, or simply stand in a hall decorated with enormous masterpieces of art. This was not a bathhouse in any sense we recognize today. It was closer to a civic cathedral, a declaration that Rome valued the beauty and cleanliness of public life. And crucially, it was open to almost everyone. This is where things get genuinely interesting, because the Roman bath was one of the few spaces in Roman social life where the rigid class hierarchy became not invisible exactly, but at least permeable. An entry fee of a quadrans, the smallest coin in Roman currency, meant that even a labourer could walk through the same doors, breathe the same steam-thick air, and soak in the same pools as a senator. In the 4th century, one account describes how aristocratic Romans would sometimes arrive at the baths accompanied by 50 personal servants, who carried fine clothes, expensive jewellery and personal belongings, and who reserved exclusive sections of the bathhouse for their master's use. So the wealthy found ways to maintain their distinction even within the equalizing space of the Thermae. And yet the fact remains, a Roman aristocrat bathed in a building his city had built for everyone using water, the same aqueduct supplied to the public fountains. There was a kind of implicit social contract in that reality. Emperors understood this perfectly. Building a new Thermae was one of the most reliable ways for an emperor to purchase goodwill from the Roman people. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, more or less wrote a promotional piece for the lavish private baths of a man named Etruscus, declaring that if you had not bathed in Etruscus's Thermae, you would die unwashed. Roman satirical writers loved the baths as a subject precisely because the baths brought together every layer of society in a state of undress, and the social comedy that resulted was apparently inexhaustible. Now, how did the Romans actually bathe? Because this is where modern expectations fall apart quite spectacularly. There was no soap. This is not a minor detail, this is fundamental. The Romans had no access to soap as we understand it. What they had instead was olive oil. And the process of Roman bathing was built entirely around this fact. You arrived at the bathhouse and changed in the apoditerium, the changing room where a slave, either your own or one provided by the establishment, watched over your clothes. Theft at the baths was apparently rampant, which tells you something useful about the equalizing power of undress. Then you moved to the exercise courtyard, the palaestra, where you might wrestle, throw a discus, lift weights made of lead, or play a ball game. The point was to work up a proper sweat. After the exercise, olive oil was rubbed generously all over your skin. You then moved into the sequence of heated rooms. First the tepidarium, the warm chamber to ease the body into the heat. Then the caldarium, the hot room heated from below by a hypocaust system of furnaces that pushed warm air through hollow tiles beneath the floor and within the walls. In the caldarium you sweated extensively, which the Romans believed opened the pores and drove impurities out through the skin. And then came the strigil. The strigil was a curved metal scraper, typically made of bronze, though wealthy Romans owned versions in silver, and archaeologists have found examples in gold. You drew it firmly along the skin, and with it came the olive oil, the sweat, the dirt, and whatever else the afternoon had deposited on your body. The mixture that accumulated on the strigil was by all accounts genuinely unpleasant to look at, a kind of grey-yellow paste of human effort. After the strigil you plunged into the frigidarium, the cold pool, to close the pores and complete the process. Then you were oiled again, this time with scented oils if you could afford them, dried, dressed, and ready for dinner. The Roman satirist Seneca the Younger, who famously lived for a period in rooms directly above a public bathhouse in the coastal town of Baiae, wrote one of the most vivid and genuinely funny descriptions of what the experience sounded like from the outside. He described hearing the weightlifters groaning under their loads, their breath bursting out in wheezing gasps. He heard the splashing of bathers leaping into the pools with the enthusiasm of someone falling from a height. He heard the food vendors shouting their prices. He heard men singing to themselves in the steam. And through all of it, he was supposedly trying to think philosophical thoughts and write letters. Whether Seneca truly minded as much as he claimed is a question his biographers have debated for centuries, but the letter survives as one of the most delightful accidental documents in classical history. Here is what I find genuinely moving about the Roman bath when I step back from the facts and think about what they represent. The Roman bath was a technology of belonging. It was a place where the act of becoming clean, something so intimate, so private in our modern sensibility, was transformed into a shared civic experience. The Roman understanding of cleanliness was not individual. It was communal. You did not get clean alone. You got clean as part of a city, as part of a civilization, surrounded by the sounds and smells and presence of your fellow human beings. Think about the contrast with today. Most of us in the modern world consider bathing one of the most private acts we perform. We lock the door. We require silence. We treat it as a moment of solitude in an otherwise crowded life. The Romans reversed this entirely. Solitude was easy to come by. What was rare, what was genuinely luxurious, was access to a magnificent shared space, to hot water produced by brilliant engineering, to gardens and libraries and art and social connection, all wrapped inside the daily ritual of cleanliness. What does that tell us about what we actually need versus what we think we need? There is one more detail I cannot leave out because it is both historically accurate and genuinely strange. The sweat and oil scraped from the bodies of athletes and gladiators at the baths was sometimes collected and sold. It was called gloios. Roman women of high status are recorded in several sources as purchasing this material as a cosmetic ingredient, something to rub into the skin for supposed health benefits. Whether this actually worked as advertised is a question best left to the imagination. But it does tell you something profound about the Roman attitude toward the body. Nothing at the baths was private. Nothing was wasted. Everything, even the most intimate residue of physical exertion, could become currency in the right hands. This is Rome. Spectacular, strange, fully human Rome. A civilization that built temples to public cleanliness and then sold the sweat of gladiators as beauty products. And speaking of what wealth looked like in the Roman world, we have talked about how Romans ate how they cleaned themselves, but we have not yet looked at where they came home to. Because the divide between the world of the Thermae and the world of the Roman street was in many ways the sharpest divide in the entire city. The home you returned to after your bath told more about your position in Roman society than almost anything else. And the contrast between those homes, the magnificent and the desperate, is a story that deserves its own telling. That is exactly where we are headed next. There is a number that stops me cold every time I come back to it. And I have been coming back to it for years because it says something about ancient Rome that no amount of marble columns or golden statues ever quite manages to convey. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the city of Rome contained approximately 46,600 insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that housed the overwhelming majority of the city's population, and 1,797 private houses. 1,797 homes for the elite against 46,600 towers of compressed human need. That ratio is not a footnote. That ratio is the skeleton of Roman civilization. We ended our last chapter stepping out of the Thermae clean-oiled and ready for the evening. Now follow your wealthy Roman host as he walks home, through a different Rome than the one the tourists always imagine, past the wide forum, past the temples and the public monuments, and then into the tangle of side streets where the city actually lived, and breathed, and unfortunately burned. The domus waited for him, his domus, and to understand what luxury actually meant to the Romans, you have to stand in that house and feel the contrast it was designed to produce. The domus, the private townhouse of a wealthy Roman family, was above all else an architecture of inwardness. Its exterior walls were largely blank, facing the street with the closed expression of a fortress. No large windows opened onto the noise and smell of the Roman road. No welcoming facade invited the passerby to look in. The whole structure turned its back on the world outside. And then when you passed through the narrow vestibulum into the atrium, the world opened up. The atrium was the heart of the domus, a large, light-filled central hall open to the sky through a rectangular gap in the roof called the compluvium. Below it sat the impluvium, a shallow rectangular pool that caught the rain. In wealthy homes, this pool might be edged in marble, decorated with mosaics, stocked with ornamental fish. The walls around the atrium were painted in elaborate frescoes, the fashionable 2nd and 4th style paintings that archaeologists have recovered from Pompeii and Herculaneum in breathtaking detail, their colours still vivid nearly 2,000 years after they were applied. Beyond the atrium lay the tablinum where the paterfamilias conducted business and displayed the wax portrait masks of his distinguished ancestors. Beyond that, the peristyle garden, a columned courtyard with cultivated plants, fountains, perhaps a small fish pond, the sounds of running water replacing the sounds of the street. Tucked around the edges were the triclinium for formal dining, the cubicula for sleeping, the library, if the family was intellectually inclined, the kitchen near the slaves' quarters in the back. The domus was designed to make 2 simultaneous and contradictory statements. The first was, "I am above this city's noise." The second was, "Please come in and witness how far above it I really am." Because every morning in that same domus the doors opened for the salutatio, that stream of clients and petitioners we discussed in our first chapter and the house had to perform. The atrium that felt like a private sanctuary after dark became a stage for social power in the morning light. This was Roman luxury in its most architectural form. Not just comfort, but the built expression of status. Now, let us climb the stairs. Not the graceful marble stairs of the domus. The other stairs, the ones that creak, the ones that get narrower as you go higher, the ones in the insula across the street and the one next door and the one after that, because in ancient Rome the insulae were everywhere, pressed between temples and townhouses, filling in every available gap in the city's dense urban fabric, growing ever taller until Augustus finally felt compelled to impose a height restriction of 70 Roman feet, and Nero reduced it further after the Great Fire of 64 of the Common Era, showed exactly what happened when 7-story wooden-framed apartment buildings and open cooking fires occupied the same small space. The insula was Rome's solution to an impossible problem. 1 million people needed to live within a walled city whose borders were effectively fixed. Land was scarce and fabulously expensive. The only logical direction was up, and so up the insulae went 6, 7, 8 stories of brick and timber, and later Roman concrete stacked one floor above the next, each level more cramped, more precarious and cheaper in rent than the one below. Think about what that meant in practice. If you were poor in ancient Rome, if you were a craftsman, a labourer, a freedman, just starting out, a soldier, just returned from service, you climbed. Literally. Every day. Up 4, 5, 6 flights of stairs to reach a room that was at most a few hundred square feet. No kitchen, no running water, no toilet. The ground floor might have a connection to the aqueduct, but water did not climb stairs by itself in the ancient world, so the upper floors relied on what you could carry. The communal latrine, if one existed, was down below. The public fountain was further still. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century, described the nightly terror of upper-floor life, with his characteristic biting humour, the constant worry about fire, about collapse, about the neighbour, whose poorly secured brazier might turn the whole building into kindling before dawn. He was not exaggerating for comic effect alone. Fires in Rome were genuinely frequent, and they moved through the insulae with devastating speed. When an insula burned or simply fell down from structural weakness, and they did fall down sometimes without any warning at all, the wealthy landlord who owned it lost property. The families living in it lost everything they possessed. And this brings us to the man whose story I think most perfectly captures the moral landscape of Roman housing, Marcus Licinius Crassus. You may know the name from the political context. He was 1/3 of the so-called First Triumvirate, alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, the 3 men who effectively controlled Roman politics in the late Republic. Plutarch, writing his biography of Crassus, described him as the wealthiest man in Rome, possibly in Roman history. His fortune is estimated to have been equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the Roman treasury. And a substantial portion of that fortune came from a business model that is almost breathtakingly cynical, even by the standards of ancient real estate speculation. Crassus owned a private fire brigade, 500 trained slaves, architects and builders among them, always ready to respond. When a fire broke out in Rome, and remember this was before any public fire service existed, Crassus's men would arrive on the scene, and then they would wait. They would stand there with their equipment and their expertise while the building burned, while the neighbours panicked, while the owner watched the value of his property collapse by the minute, and Crassus or his representative would approach the distressed owner with an offer, a very low offer, a distressed sale offer, an offer shaped precisely by the fact that right now at this moment the building is on fire and no one else is going to help you. If the owner accepted, the fire brigade went to work. If he did not, the brigade stood and watched, and then Crassus bought the charred remains at an even lower price. Plutarch records that through this process, combined with purchasing properties seized and sold by the dictator Sulla from his political enemies, Crassus came to own the largest part of Rome itself. The city was in a very literal sense his property. Cicero, a contemporary and frequent political ally, is recorded as saying with barely disguised disgust that Crassus was happy when one of his own insulae collapsed from poor construction, because it gave him the opportunity to charge higher rents for whatever he built on the cleared ground. Sit with that for a moment. The buildings were falling down because they were built cheaply on purpose by men who had no intention of living in them. And when they fell, the men who built them profited from the rebuilding. The tenants who survived the collapse had nowhere to go but back into another insula, another floor up, another step further from the water, and safety and light they needed to simply exist. Here is the question I keep asking myself when I spend time with this history. Was the luxury of the Roman elite meaningful without the suffering of the Roman poor as its backdrop? Could the domus have felt so serene if there were no insula to contrast it with? Could the atrium garden have felt so tranquil without the noise of the street just on the other side of the blank exterior wall? I think the Romans knew the answer to this, even if they did not phrase it quite this way. The distance between your life and the life immediately outside your door was itself a form of wealth. Not comfort, not beauty, not space distance. The further you could get from the smell of the street, the fire risk of the upper floors, the communal latrine and the shared well, the richer you were. The closer the street pressed, the poorer. It was a gradient measured in stairs and walls and water pressure. 2,000 years later, in cities around the world, we are still measuring by the same gradient. We just call it square footage and neighbourhood and zip code. But if the domus represented the private face of Roman wealth, it told only part of the story. Because what a Roman wore when he stepped out of that domus and onto the street, the fabric on his back, the colour in his cloth, the pins at his shoulder, said something just as loud and just as deliberate as the architecture he had just left behind. Roman fashion was not about beauty, it was about power, and the story of what the Romans wore is stranger, more physically demanding, and more revealing than almost anything hanging in the closets of the wealthy today. That is where we are headed next. Let me ask you something genuinely curious. What is the most expensive piece of clothing you have ever owned? A tailored suit, maybe, or a designer dress saved up for over months. Something beautiful. Something that made you feel when you put it on like a better version of yourself. Now consider this. The single most prestigious garment in the entire Roman world was a semicircular blanket of undyed wool, roughly 12 to 20 feet of fabric, with no sleeves, no pockets, no buttons, no fasteners of any kind that needed at least one other person to drape correctly onto your body, that weighed somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds, once it was on, that made you sweat through any season, warmer than midwinter, that was nearly impossible to keep clean, and that prohibited you through sheer structural inconvenience from doing almost anything physically useful while wearing it. This was the toga, the most powerful status symbol in the most powerful civilization on Earth. And the more I sit with that contradiction, the more I think the Romans understood something about power and luxury that we have almost entirely forgotten. The toga had a long history by the time Rome reached its imperial peak. It had begun, scholars believe, as something practical, a simple wool blanket worn by early Roman farmers and herdsmen for warmth. Over the centuries, as Rome grew from a small city-state into an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria, the toga grew with it. And as it grew, it became less practical with every generation. By the late Republic, the standard citizen's toga measured around 5.5 meters in length and nearly 3 meters at its widest point. By the imperial period, some formal togas were even larger. The mathematical relationship between the toga's growing impracticality and Rome's growing power was not accidental. It was the whole point. Because here is what the toga was actually communicating, and why the Romans who wore it understood this perfectly. If you were standing in the Roman Forum in a toga, sweating, encumbered, immobile, entirely dependent on the draping skills of a skilled slave to keep the thing from unraveling off your body, you were telling everyone around you something specific and unmistakable. You were telling them that you did not work with your hands. You could not work with your hands dressed like this. You were a man of leisure, of deliberation, of elevated civic existence. The toga was not comfortable clothing. It was proof that you did not need to be comfortable in the way that ordinary people needed to be comfortable. Your comfort was your conspicuousness. The Romans had a phrase for this concept, otium. It meant leisure, rest, freedom from the demands of labour. And the toga was otium made visible in wool. Not all togas were equal, of course. Rome was a civilization obsessed with visible hierarchy, and the toga was one of its primary instruments for communicating exactly where on that hierarchy you stood. The plain white toga virilis, the toga of manhood, was what an ordinary citizen wore after coming of age, usually between 14 and 17 years old. The transition from the childhood toga praetexta with its purple border to the adult toga virilis was a formal ceremony the moment a young man legally became a Roman adult, with the right to vote, to marry, and to set up his own household. This ceremony was called the Depositio Togae, and it was one of the most significant rites of passage in Roman life. But above the plain white citizen toga, the distinctions multiplied rapidly and precisely. Senators wore tunics beneath their toga, with a broad purple stripe down the front called the latus clavus. Equestrians, the upper middle tier of Roman society, wore a narrower stripe, the angustus clavus. Candidates for political office wore a toga brightened to brilliant white with chalk, the toga candida, which is incidentally exactly where the English word candidate comes from. If you were a general celebrating a military triumph, you wore the toga picta richly embroidered in purple and gold, thread a garment so magnificent and so charged with meaning that it was associated with the divine. And in the imperial period, only the emperor himself could wear a toga of solid purple, a sumptuary law backed by the full force of Roman authority. Purple. We need to talk about purple. Tyrian purple, the specific deep reddish-violet colour that Rome elevated to the summit of its luxury hierarchy, was produced from the glandular secretions of murex sea snails found along the eastern Mediterranean coast. This is not a straightforward process. You do not simply find a snail, squeeze it, and get purple fabric. You find 12,000 snails, and after a labour-intensive process of crushing, fermenting, and treating the resulting material you extract, approximately 1.5 grams of pure dye. Enough if you were exceptionally careful with it to colour the hem of a single garment. 1 pound of finished Tyrian purple dye a pound, the weight of a decent hardcover book, was valued in a price edict issued by Emperor Diocletian in the year 301 of the Common Era at 150,000 denarii. The historian of Roman dress B. Cassot has noted that this was literally worth more than its equivalent weight in gold, not worth as much as gold, worth more. A pound of purple dye versus a pound of gold, and the dye won. For those who could not afford genuine Tyrian purple, which was almost everyone, even among the wealthy Roman merchants, offered imitations using less expensive dyes. Indian indigo arrived through trade networks in the imperial period and was considered a prestige substitute, though Romans remained somewhat snobbish about whether it truly captured the correct shade. There were apparently wrong purples and right purples, and knowing the difference was itself a mark of sophistication. Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century reportedly refused his own wife's request to purchase a mantle dyed in Tyrian purple silk, on the grounds that the cost was simply too extreme even for the imperial household, and the Emperor Elagabalus, who ruled briefly in the early 3rd century, and is remembered primarily for his extraordinary extravagances, is recorded as having been the first Roman emperor to wear garments made entirely of pure silk, a detail that contemporary Roman writers noted not as admiration but as evidence of dangerous excess. Even silk had its moral dimensions. There is something I find quietly fascinating about the psychology of Roman fashion that I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it says something true about human nature that has not changed much in 2,000 years. The toga was genuinely unpopular. The Romans themselves, by and large, found it uncomfortable, impractical, and difficult to manage. Tacitus, writing in the late 1st century, complained about the common people of Rome as a vulgus tunicatus, a tunic-wearing crowd, with more than a hint of condescension. Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century had to issue an actual edict requiring senators and equestrians to wear their togas in public, which strongly implies that given a choice, many of them were simply not bothering. Even those entitled to the toga preferred, whenever they could get away with it, the comfortable tunic that everyone else was wearing anyway. And yet, when the occasion demanded, when the social stakes were high enough, when the right people were watching, the toga went on. Every fold and drape carefully arranged by a specialized slave, every inch of white wool brushed and laundered to an appropriate brightness. Because the message it sent was irreplaceable. There was no substitute for the visual language of that particular cloth draped in that particular way. No tunic, however fine, said what the toga said. This is, when you think about it, remarkably familiar. How many of us own formal clothing we find uncomfortable, even painful, that we wear exclusively for the occasions when being seen in the right way matters more than our personal comfort? The tuxedo with its stiff collar, the suit jacket on a hot day, the heels that hurt, the tie that no one needs but everyone wears to certain kinds of meetings, the mechanisms of the signal change, the underlying logic does not. And for women of the Roman elite, the performance of fashion was no less demanding, no less laden with social meaning, and no less physically constraining. The stola, the long-sleeved outer garment worn by married Roman women of good standing, was like the toga an identity document in fabric form. It announced marital status, respectability, and social legitimacy. Women who were not entitled to wear it, those who'd been convicted of adultery, or who worked in professions considered socially disreputable, were legally barred from it. In its place, they might be compelled to wear the toga, which in this context was not an honour but a public mark of shame. The toga, it seems, could travel in both directions on the social hierarchy depending on who was wearing it and why. The jewellery worn by wealthy Roman women, gold pins, pearl earrings, emerald rings, amber pendants imported from the Baltic coast, represented fortunes in portable wealth and served simultaneously as personal adornment and as a walking advertisement of household resources. Pliny the Elder, characteristically having a strong opinion, complained bitterly about Roman women's appetite for pearls and precious stones, noting that the wife of the general Paulinus alone wore pearls and emeralds worth 40 million sestertii. He described this as shocking. He also described it in extraordinary detail, which tells you everything you need to know about the relationship between Roman moralizing and Roman fascination with luxury. What makes all of this genuinely interesting to me, what elevates it beyond a simple inventory of old clothes, is what Roman fashion reveals about the relationship between suffering and status. The toga was uncomfortable by design. The Tyrian purple was expensive by necessity. The stola was restrictive by intention. These were not accidental features. They were the point. A garment that required effort, expense, or physical endurance to wear was by that very fact a demonstration of capacity. You could bear this inconvenience. You could afford this excess. You occupied a position in the world where appearance mattered enough to justify all of it. In Rome, what you wore was not self-expression. It was a declaration of political and social position that the entire city was expected to read correctly. And they did. Romans were extraordinarily good at reading each other's clothing. They had to be. The wrong toga at the wrong moment, the wrong stripe, the wrong shade of purple. These were not merely fashion errors. They were social ones with real consequences. We have now followed our wealthy Roman from his morning salutatio through his feast, his bath, his streets, and his home, and the clothes on his back as he stepped into the world. But beneath all of this, beneath the food and the water and the housing and the fashion, there was a human engine that made every single piece of it possible, and that engine ran on something darker than marble, darker than garum, darker than even Tyrian purple. It ran on people who were owned. The story of Roman slavery as a luxury system is one of the most important and most uncomfortable parts of this entire history, and it is exactly where we are going next. Here is a number that I have never been able to shake since the first time I read it. At the height of the Roman Empire, somewhere around the 2nd century of the Common Era, historians estimate that the total population of enslaved people across the empire may have approached 10 billion human beings. 10 million. In the city of Rome itself, a city of perhaps 900,000 inhabitants, the slave population around the year 1 of the Common Era is estimated at between 300,000 and 350,000 people. That is roughly 1 in every 3 people you would have passed on the street. 1 in 3. And here is the part that makes this number particularly uncomfortable to sit with. The Romans by and large did not regard this as a crisis. They did not regard it as a problem requiring debate or resolution. They regarded it as furniture, necessary, useful, and for those who could afford the finest pieces an opportunity for considerable aesthetic display. Because in Rome the people you owned were not just labour, they were luxury. The Roman agricultural writer Varro, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, classified the instruments of a farm into 3 categories. The first was the kind that speaks, by which he meant slaves. The second was the kind that makes sounds but cannot form words, animals. The third was mute tools. Varro placed a human being in the same taxonomy as a plough. He did not do this with cruelty. He did it with the calm, procedural logic of a man writing a practical guide to estate management. That perhaps more than any single act of violence tells you something essential about how deeply slavery was embedded in the Roman way of thinking about the world. The Roman legal term for a slave was serves, Under Roman law, a slave had no legal personhood whatsoever. A slave could not enter into marriage recognized by Roman law. A slave could not give testimony in court except under torture, because the legal theory held that only the threat of pain could extract truth from someone with no stake in the civic order. A slave could not own property in the conventional sense, though some slaves were permitted by their masters to accumulate a personal fund of money called a peculium, which they could use and even grow, but which technically belonged to the master and could be reclaimed at any point. A slave was in the precise language of Roman jurisprudence as a thing, and yet the story of Roman slavery is far stranger, far more contradictory, and in certain specific ways far more philosophically troubling than this cold legal framework suggests. Let me tell you about a man named Epictetus. He was born around 50 years after the birth of the Common Era somewhere in Hierapolis, in what is now Western Turkey. His name in Greek means simply acquired or gained, a nickname essentially, marking the fact that he was someone else's property. He was brought to Rome as a slave and assigned to a master named Epaphroditus, a powerful freedman who served as personal secretary to the Emperor Nero. Epaphroditus was by the ancient accounts a man capable of considerable cruelty. There is a story, possibly legendary, possibly not, that Epaphroditus once twisted Epictetus's leg in a fit of anger, breaking it, while Epictetus calmly warned him, "You will break it." When the bone snapped, Epictetus reportedly said only, "I told you so." Whether or not this happened exactly as described, the story survived because it captured something true about the man. Epictetus was even in chains philosophically unbreakable, because Epaphroditus, despite his cruelty, allowed Epictetus to study. And the teacher Epictetus studied under was Musonius Rufus, one of the most respected Stoic philosophers of the age. After gaining his freedom sometime after Nero's death in 68 of the Common Era, Epictetus founded his own school of philosophy in Rome, which quickly attracted students from across the empire. When Emperor Domitian expelled all philosophers from Rome, Epictetus went into exile in Nicopolis in Greece, where he established a new school and taught Stoic philosophy for the rest of his life. Emperor Hadrian befriended him. The philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius cited his influence in his private journals, which we now call the Meditations. A former slave, a man who had been legally classified as a thing, shaped the inner life of a Roman emperor. Epictetus himself never wrote a word. Everything we have from him was transcribed by his student Arrian, who recorded his lectures faithfully, because he recognized he was hearing something rare. And what Epictetus said from his position of intimate bodily knowledge of what it meant to be owned was something like this: that external circumstances, wealth, freedom, even the condition of one's own body, belong to the category of things that are not truly ours. The only thing that is truly ours is our capacity to choose how we respond. No chain, he argued, can bind a free mind. I find this both deeply moving and deeply unsettling at the same time. Moving because it represents a human being refusing to be entirely defined by the worst thing that had happened to him. Unsettling because it is exactly the kind of philosophy that an institution built on human bondage finds very convenient. If the enslaved person's inner freedom is what matters, then the outer condition of their enslavement becomes philosophically secondary. Epictetus himself, to his credit, never quite went that far, but others certainly used his framework to go there. On the other end of the social spectrum entirely there was Seneca, the wealthy Stoic philosopher-senator and advisor to Emperor Nero. And Seneca wrote something remarkable. In his 47th letter to his friend Lucilius, which historians now call On Master and Slave, Seneca described a dinner he had attended at which the host slaves were required to stand in absolute silence throughout the meal unable to cough, clear their throat, speak, or make any sound on pain of punishment. Seneca found this repulsive. He wrote, "They are slaves, no, they are men. Slaves, no, they are comrades. Slaves, no, they are unpretentious friends." He urged Lucilius to eat at the same table with his slaves, to treat them as potential friends, to remember that fortune alone separated the free man from the enslaved. He described masters who were themselves enslaved to lust, to greed, to ambition, to fear, and asked whether the legal condition of slavery was truly the only kind that mattered. It is genuinely a stunning document to find coming from the 1st century of the Common Era. And yet, Seneca owned slaves himself, many of them. He wrote these compassionate words about the shared humanity of the enslaved while personally holding people in bondage. He never advocated for abolition. He never argued that slavery should end. His letter to Lucilius was in the end advice about how a Stoic master should feel, and feel better about the people he owned. One historian described it precisely as a text more interested in the liberation of the master's conscience than the liberation of the slave's body. I am not telling you this to condemn Seneca as a hypocrite exactly. I am telling you this because the contradiction he embodied was not an individual moral failure. It was a structural one. Roman civilization produced extraordinary philosophy, extraordinary art, extraordinary law, extraordinary engineering, and all of it rested on a foundation of human beings legally classified as objects. The most enlightened Roman minds of the age could articulate why this was wrong, and continue participating in the system without apparent resolution. That is not a Roman problem. That is a human one. But let us come back to luxury specifically. Because the way wealthy Romans used slavery as a status display system was extraordinarily specific and rather remarkable. It was not simply that wealthy Romans owned slaves. Of course they did. Even modest middle-class Roman households typically owned one or two. What distinguished the truly wealthy was the number, the specialization, and the visibility of the slaves they kept. Pliny the Younger, the writer and administrator, whose letters give us some of our most vivid accounts of late 1st century Roman life, is documented as owning 4,116 slaves on his estates. Crassus, whose fire brigade we discussed earlier in this series, owned 500 slaves specifically trained as architects and builders, not for his own household comfort but as a real estate investment vehicle. These were men and women whose skills has been cultivated deliberately and expensively to serve a single man's commercial ambitions. In elite urban households, the degree of specialization among domestic slaves was extraordinary. There was a slave whose entire function was to announce the names of guests at the door, a nomenclator whose job was to whisper, "This is Gaius Senator, you met him at the baths last summer," as each visitor arrived, saving the master from the social embarrassment of forgetting a name. There were slaves designated specifically to read aloud during dinner called anagnastai, who were expected to have cultivated pleasant voices and the ability to perform text with appropriate expression. There were slaves whose sole function was to trim the master's beard tonsure, whose skill with a blade was considered a form of artistry. There were cosmetai, who tended to the mistress's hair and appearance, cubiculari, who managed the sleeping chambers, capsari, who carried books, pedisequi, who followed behind their master in public at a respectful distance as a living demonstration of his household's depth. A truly wealthy Roman senator might maintain a domestic staff of dozens, all of them, specialists, all of them visible proof of what their master could afford. When this senator walked through the city to the forum, attended by a retinue of slaves in clean tunics, the message communicated to every Roman who watched him pass was exact and unmistakable. This man has so much wealth that he can afford to employ human beings full-time to carry his books, announce his visitors and trim his beard. Each specialized slave was in a very real sense a walking unit of a status information. This is what the scholar Keith Bradley has called slavery as conspicuous consumption. The enslaved person was not merely labor, they were display, and the slave market itself was a luxury industry in miniature. Slaves were bought and sold in the Forum Boarium and the Septa Julia, the great markets of Rome with tags hung around their necks, listing their origin, age, skills, and any known behavioral or health issues. A slave with no defects to declare had their feet whitened with chalk as a sign of quality. Greek slaves were particularly prized in educated households, because Greek was the language of philosophy and literature. Having a Greek-educated slave as a tutor for your children was both practically useful and a considerable social signal. A skilled Greek doctor as a household physician was even more so. The prices paid for exceptional slaves were staggering. A highly educated Greek slave, someone capable of teaching rhetoric, philosophy, and letters, could command prices equivalent to what it cost to buy a modest house. A skilled physician might cost even more. These were not purchases of labor, they were investments in household prestige, and for those at the very top of Roman society, the purchase of slaves from exotic or prestigious origins was its own form of luxury consumption. Egyptian slaves, Nubian slaves, fair-haired German slaves all carried different social meanings, different associations of prestige, novelty, or symbolic power for the household that displayed them. The Roman Empire's trade networks, which we will explore in more depth later in this series, fed an insatiable market not just for silk and spices, but for human beings from every corner of the known world. There is one more dimension of this story that I want to sit with before we move on, because I think it is the one that historians find most philosophically significant, and it is the one that the Romans themselves seemed most uncomfortable examining directly. The prospect of manumission freedom from slavery was real in Rome, and the Romans used it deliberately as a system of incentive and control. A slave who worked diligently, who proved trustworthy and skilled, who accumulated enough money in their personal peculium might eventually purchase their own freedom. Some masters freed slaves in their wills, some freed slaves who had served with particular distinction. The ceremony of manumission involved a praetor, a magistrate touching the slave on the shoulder with a rod, after which the freed person was given a felt cap called a pileus, the symbol of their new legal status as a libertus, or liberta, a freedman or freedwoman. Once free, a formerly enslaved person became a Roman citizen, with the right to vote, to own property, to enter into legal marriage. They could operate businesses. Some became extremely wealthy. One notable example was C. Caecilius Isidorus, a freedman who by his own account in his will recorded around the year 8 of the Common Era, had lost a great deal of property in the civil wars, but still died owning more than 4,000 slaves, 257 horses and property that generated extraordinary income. A man who had once been property himself dying as one of the wealthiest men in Rome. The Romans found this socially ambiguous, to put it politely. Tacitus and Pliny the Elder both complained bitterly about freedmen who accumulated wealth beyond what the social order felt was appropriate for their origins. The freedman Pallas, who served as financial secretary to Emperor Claudius and grew extraordinarily rich in the process, was particularly despised by the senatorial class for this reason. There was something about a former slave becoming wealthy that the Roman elite found deeply disturbing, not because they objected to wealth itself, obviously, but because it confused the signals. The entire apparatus of Roman status communication depended on clear, readable hierarchies. A rich freedman scrambled those hierarchies in ways that powerful men found uncomfortable. And yet the possibility of manumission was also, from the slave owner's perspective, a system of extraordinary cleverness, because the prospect of eventual freedom gave enslaved people a reason to work diligently and remain loyal rather than resist or revolt. The incentive of freedom kept the human engine running. Even liberation in Rome was a management tool. There is a question I have been turning over in my mind throughout all of this, and I want to leave it with you for a moment. When we admire Roman civilization, its architecture, its law, its roads, its philosophy, its literature, we are admiring something built on a foundation that the civilization's own most thoughtful members could identify as morally wrong and could not bring themselves to dismantle. What does that tell us about the relationship between great civilizations and the foundations they rest on? And is the discomfort of that question a Roman problem, or does it have a somewhat wider application? I will leave that where it is. What I will say is this: the Roman luxury system we've been tracing through this entire series, the food, the baths, the housing, the fashion, the thousands of specialized domestic slaves, was not simply a collection of expensive pleasures enjoyed by a fortunate few. It was an entire philosophy of what it meant to be human expressed through consumption and display. And the most extravagant display of all, the one that cost the most and communicated the most and left the deepest mark on history, was entertainment. The spectacle that Rome built for its citizens, both as genuine pleasure and as political instrument, was a machine of breathtaking scale and moral complexity. And that is exactly where we are headed next. Let me give you a number that I think puts everything we have been discussing into a different frame. By the late 4th century of the Common Era, the Roman calendar had set aside 177 days of the year for official public games ludi. That is nearly half the year. Nearly half of every Roman citizen's life was officially designated for entertainment, provided at enormous expense by the state and by the wealthy men who competed to fund it. Pause on that for a moment. Not weekend football, not occasional concerts, not a streaming service you can turn off. Half the year structured into the calendar itself, given over to the spectacle of the arena and the racetrack. And the moment you understand that number, you stop being able to see Roman entertainment as entertainment at all. You start seeing it for what it actually was: a machine. A very large, very expensive, extraordinarily effective machine for producing consent. The Romans had a word for this machine. Well, not for the machine exactly, but for what it produced. It came from the pen of the satirical poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, at a moment when he looked at his fellow citizens and felt something close to despair. He wrote that the Roman people who had once voted for wars, awarded consulships, commanded legions, shaped the destiny of the Republic, now wanted only 2 things: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Feed the belly and dazzle the eyes, Juvenal said, and the people will ask you no uncomfortable questions about anything else. This phrase has travelled through 2,000 years of history with its meaning intact because the observation it encodes is so durable. But I want to push past the phrase itself and look at what was actually happening inside the machine. Because the Roman entertainment complex was not a simple cynical trick. It was something considerably stranger and more fascinating than that. Start with the Circus Maximus. Not the Colosseum, we will get there, but the Circus Maximus, which was actually the more important venue in the daily life of ordinary Romans, and is, I think, the more instructive one for understanding what Roman entertainment was really doing. The Circus Maximus occupied a valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills, and by the time of Augustus, Julius Caesar's rebuilding had extended its track to approximately 650 meters in length and 125 meters in width. It could accommodate at minimum 150,000 spectators. Later accounts suggest it may have held considerably more at certain events. To give you a comparison, the largest stadium in the world today, Narendra Modi Stadium in India, holds 132,000 people. The Circus Maximus in a city of perhaps 1 million inhabitants was larger, and on race days, which by the late imperial period meant 66 days a year with 24 races per day, what Romans saw there was not merely sport. The day began with a pompous census, a formal sacred procession through the streets featuring statues of 12 different Roman gods carried on litters accompanied by priests, musicians, dancers, and eventually the charioteers themselves. It was a religious ceremony that transformed into a sporting event, which made the entire occasion sacred and political simultaneously. The emperor's box, the Pulvinar, was directly connected to the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill by a private passage positioning the ruler at the literal centre of the spectacle, presiding over the city's most beloved form of collective joy. The racing teams, 4 of them identified by colour, the reds, whites, blues and greens, had fan bases of a ferocity that anyone who has followed football rivalries will recognise immediately. Fans wore their faction's colour into the streets. They placed enormous bets. They composed songs. They cursed their opponents' horses, their drivers, their families. Curse tablets found by archaeologists, small lead sheets inscribed with elaborate wishes for the destruction of specific horses and charioteers, show us the emotional intensity of Roman race fans with a vividness that the formal literary sources cannot quite match. One tablet reads approximately, "Bind the legs, the hands, the start of the green and white factions, a prayer for your enemies' horses to stumble coming out of the gate." The most successful charioteers became something Rome had never quite had before genuine celebrities. Gaius Apuleius Diocles, a driver from the Iberian Peninsula who raced primarily in the 2nd century of the Common Era, won 1,462 races in a career spanning 24 years. A commemorative inscription, essentially his retirement monument, survives and records his career statistics in detail. Historians who have calculated his career earnings in modern equivalent values have arrived at figures in the range of $15 billion. A freedman, a man who had once been of slave status, becoming among the wealthiest and most celebrated people in the Roman world through the quality of his horsemanship. And the young charioteer Scorpus, who won more than 2,000 races before his death at approximately 27 years old, inspired the poet Martial to write 3 separate elegies for him. Not an emperor, a charioteer. Now, the Colosseum, properly speaking, it was called the Flavian Amphitheatre, and it was built by Emperor Vespasian beginning around the year 70 of the Common Era, on land that had previously been occupied by Emperor Nero's extravagant private palace, a deliberate statement by the new dynasty that imperial power belonged to the people, not to the emperor's personal pleasure. Construction was completed under Vespasian's son Titus in 80 of the Common Era. The opening games lasted 100 days. Contemporary accounts record that 11,000 animals were killed in the games, celebrating Trajan's conquest of Dacia in 107 of the Common Era. The structure itself was an engineering achievement of the first order. Built on approximately 100,000 cubic meters of travertine marble and held together with 300 tons of iron clamps, it rose 4 stories to roughly 48 meters a height, equivalent to a modern 16-story building. At capacity, it could seat between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. The seating was as everything in Rome was precisely hierarchical senators, in the front rows, on marble seats, distinguished citizens behind them, then ordinary citizens on stone benches, and at the very top in the upper colonnade, the poor and women as far from the action as it was possible to be while still technically being inside the building. Beneath the arena floor, which was sand absorbing the colour and evidence of what happened above it, lay the hypogum, an extraordinary underground system of tunnels, cages and hydraulic lifts. Animals could be brought up through trapdoors directly into the arena. Scenery could be raised. Elaborate sets, artificial forests, rocky landscapes could be constructed and dismantled between events. The spectacle the audience watched was not simply violence. It was theatre, very expensive theatre, with animals and humans as its performers and the entire machinery of the Roman state as its production company. The gladiatorial games the Munera had begun centuries earlier as funerary rites, a sacrifice of blood in honour of the dead. By the time of the Empire, this origin had been largely absorbed into something else, a performance of Roman values, virtue, courage, endurance, the refusal to surrender without a fight. These were not simply things that happened to be admired in Rome. They were the foundational claims of Roman identity. And the arena was where those values were enacted ritually repeatedly before tens of thousands of witnesses in a form that was visceral and physical rather than merely spoken or written. The gladiator who fought with skill and courage was admired even across the social barrier that marked gladiatorial combat as the profession of the lowly. Successful gladiators received endorsements. Their images appeared on pottery, on lamps, on mosaics in private homes. Children played with clay figurines of famous fighters. Women, including, according to Juvenal, a senator's wife named Epia, ran away with gladiators drawn by what he described with evident disapproval as the peculiar glamour of dangerous men. The gladiator was infirmly legally of low social status, and simultaneously the object of mass adoration. Roman celebrity culture had exactly the same tension. We still recognize the person we look down on structurally as the person we cannot stop looking at personally. And then there were the venations, the animal hunts. Exotic animals from every corner of the empire, lions and leopards from North Africa, elephants from sub-Saharan Africa, crocodiles from Egypt, rhinoceroses from the eastern edge of the known world, even the occasional giraffe were captured, transported at enormous expense across thousands of miles, held in the hippodrome beneath the Colosseum, and then released into the arena to be hunted or to fight. Augustus boasted that during his reign 26 venations were staged at which 3,500 animals were killed. Trajan's Dacian Triumph Games killed 11,000 animals in 4 months. The historian Keith Hopkins calculated that between the opening of the Colosseum in 80 of the Common Era and its use for gladiatorial combat ending in the 5th century, approximately 500,000 animals and perhaps 350,000 human beings, condemned criminals, prisoners of war, gladiators lost their lives within its walls. A number so large that it is almost impossible to process, and yet somehow it does not even feel like the most important number when you think about what those games actually accomplish politically. Because here is what I've been building toward. The modern reading of bread and circuses tends to frame it as a simple manipulation, stupid people bribed with distractions. But I think Juvenal was making a more sophisticated and more melancholy observation than that. He was watching the Roman people make a rational exchange. They gave up the exercise of genuine political power, the power to vote meaningfully, to hold magistrates accountable to determine the course of the Republic in exchange for security, food and spectacle. And they made this exchange not because they were stupid, but because the spectacle was genuinely magnificent. The food was genuinely needed, and the political power they were giving up had already become in practical terms mostly illusory anyway. The emperors who most successfully provided entertainment, Augustus, Trajan, Hadrian, the Antonines, are remembered as good emperors. Not coincidentally, they were also the emperors who maintained political stability. The provision of spectacle was not separate from governance. It was governance. It was the mechanism through which the emperor demonstrated his care for the Roman people and received in return their active, visible, emotionally engaged consent. When emperors gave the crowd what they wanted, the crowd gave the emperor something in return that no army could fully provide, the feeling that the whole city was on his side. There is a detail about the Roman games that I find quietly remarkable, and that I have never seen discussed quite the way I want to discuss it here. The crowd at the Colosseum had genuine power over the outcome of gladiatorial contests. When a fighter was wounded and unable to continue, he could appeal to the crowd, raising a finger to signal surrender. The crowd could then show missio mercy by waving handkerchiefs and calling for the fighter to be spared, or they could demand he be finished. The editor of the games, the official presiding over the event, would take the crowd's signal into account, though he retained formal authority. The emperor, if present, could override either. This meant that in the context of the arena, a labourer in the cheap seats at the top of the Colosseum had a small but real say over whether a man lived or died. Nowhere else in imperial Rome did the ordinary citizen have that kind of visible, immediate power. The arena was paradoxically one of the most direct forms of democratic participation available to the Roman plebs, and it was carefully structured to be satisfying without being politically threatening. You could express your will, but only about gladiators. I want to leave you with a question that I find myself coming back to every time I think about this. We look at the Roman entertainment machine, the Circus Maximus, and its chariot factions, the Colosseum, and its carefully staged spectacles, and we see something that feels both foreign and familiar at the same time. The celebrity obsession, the team loyalties, the emotional investment in people we will never meet. The way that collective excitement at a great spectacle creates briefly a sense of unity and shared identity that ordinary life rarely provides. The way that the provision of entertainment becomes tangled up with questions of power and consent. I am not going to draw the obvious comparison. You can do that yourself, and you have probably already done it. What I will say is this: Juvenal was writing satire, which means he was exaggerating to make a point. But the best satire tends to exaggerate something that is genuinely there. The Romans built an entertainment complex of unparalleled scale because they understood at some level in the way that institutions understand things without ever saying them plainly, that a population absorbed in spectacle is a population that requires management, not suppression. The machine worked, and having fed the city's belly and dazzled its eyes through food, through spectacle, through architecture, through fashion, and through the thousands of small daily luxuries that distinguished Roman life from the lives of the people Rome had conquered, the question becomes what happened when the machine's resources began to run short. What does an empire built on visible abundance do when the abundance starts to become an elaborate fiction? That is a story about medicine, about beauty, about the extraordinary lengths the Roman body went to in order to maintain the appearance of vitality and youth. And it is the story we're telling next. Somewhere in a 2nd century Roman cosmetic shop, a wealthy woman was purchasing the finest face whitening cream money could buy. It was made from white lead. She knew it was poisonous. She bought it anyway. That detail, that one small, strange detail, has stayed with me longer than almost anything else I've encountered in researching this series. Not because it is shocking, though it is, but because it is so recognizable. The willingness to pursue beauty at the cost of health, the trust placed in social convention over individual judgment, the quiet understanding that looking a certain way is worth a certain price. These are not ancient Roman problems. They are human ones, and they have a 2,000-year paper trail to prove it. This is the story of what Roman bodies went through in the name of health and beauty, and what it reveals about the civilization that considered both to be forms of luxury. Start with the medicine, because the medicine matters enormously for understanding everything else. By the time of the empire, Rome had inherited the entire Greek medical tradition, and what it had built on top of that inheritance was genuinely impressive for its era. The Roman military alone had established a network of hospitals valetudinaria along the frontiers of the empire, staffed by trained medical personnel. Surgical instruments recovered from Pompeii and from military sites along the Rhine and Danube frontiers include forceps scalpels, bone saws, probes, catheters, and arterial clamps of a sophistication that was not matched again in Europe until the early modern period. Roman surgeons performed cataract operations. They conducted caesarean sections in the most critical cases. They performed what the physician Celsus described as ear reconstruction for those whose ears had been damaged by heavy jewellery, and the physician Galen described early skin grafting procedures. In the 1st century of the Common Era, Rome was producing medicine that was by the standards of world history up to that point remarkably good. And then there was Galen himself. Claudius Galenus of Pergamon, born around 129 of the Common Era in what is now Western Turkey, is one of the most consequential medical minds in the entire history of Western civilization. His first position as a physician was as the doctor for a gladiatorial school in Pergamon, a job that gave him something no other physician of his era could easily obtain: direct repeated observation of the inside of the human body. Because gladiators were injured in combat regularly, and those injuries were serious enough to require real intervention, and yet the gladiators themselves were valuable enough to their owners that they received genuine medical care rather than being left to recover or expire on their own. Galen later described the gladiators' wounds as windows into the human body. He learned anatomy from men who were still alive when he was observing it. He moved to Rome in 162 of the Common Era, and eventually became the personal physician to Emperor Marcus Aurelius. He wrote more than 500 treatises on anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, surgery, diet, and the relationship between the mind and the body. He was the first physician to demonstrate that arteries carry blood rather than air. He identified the difference between venous and arterial blood. He showed that the larynx generates the voice. His works remain the standard reference for Western medicine for well over 1,000 years, not surpassed until the anatomist Vesalius in the 16th century looked at actual human cadavers and found places where Galen, working from animals, had made errors in his models of human anatomy. For those who could afford him and Galen's fees were by all accounts considerable. This was Roman luxury medicine at its absolute peak. The personal physician of an emperor, arguably the most sophisticated medical mind in the ancient world, making house calls. But here is where things get complicated and considerably more interesting. Because Galen's medicine, for all its genuine brilliance, was built on a framework, the theory of the four humours inherited from Hippocrates, that was fundamentally incorrect in ways Galen himself could not have known. The theory held that the body contained four essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was balance between these humours. Disease was imbalance, and the entire edifice of Roman medical treatment, the prescribed diets, the herbal remedies, the bleedings and purgings and dietary restrictions, rested on this framework, which meant that even the best Roman medicine was from a modern perspective working on a partially wrong map of how the body actually functions. This produced some genuinely good medicine. The emphasis on diet, exercise, rest, and clean air had real benefits regardless of the theoretical explanation attached to them. And it produced some genuinely alarming medicine, which is where the fun begins. Epilepsy, for example, was mysterious and frightening to Roman physicians who did not know it was neurological in origin. The treatment recommended by multiple Roman medical authorities, including the scholar Pliny the Elder, was to drink warm blood from the cut throat of a freshly killed gladiator. The reasoning was that gladiators represented the peak of physical vitality, and their blood, particularly at the moment of death when the body's life force was believed to be most concentrated, could transfer that vitality to the person who consumed it. Scribonius Largus, a Roman physician who wrote in the 1st century, described spectators stepping forward to collect and drink blood from fallen gladiators in the arena. This was not fringe behavior. This was medical advice. For headaches, Pliny recommended placing an electric ray, a torpedo fish, on the head of the sufferer. The numbness produced by the fish's electrical discharge was supposed to relieve pain. This is remarkably a very early and entirely accidental application of what we would now recognize as electrotherapy. It probably did work, at least partially, even if the Romans had no idea why. Cabbage was, according to the agricultural writer Cato the Elder, a cure for nearly everything. His 2,000-word treatise on the medicinal properties of cabbage covered headaches, digestive complaints, wounds, vision problems and dislocations, and concluded that cabbage would cure all internal organs which are suffering. Cato also suggested that bathing in the urine of a person who ate a great deal of cabbage promoted fertility. This is the same Cato who was considered the model of Roman pragmatism and good sense. And of course, there was the matter of urine more broadly. Roman physicians used urine diagnostically, examining its color clarity and in some cases its taste to identify various conditions. Galen himself upgraded earlier observations about urine into something approaching a systematic diagnostic methodology. The use of urine as a mouthwash and teeth-whitening agent was widespread and well documented. The ammonia in aged urine does have genuine whitening properties, and the Romans were correct that it worked, even if the experience of using it was presumably considerable. Now, the cosmetics. Roman beauty culture was sophisticated, elaborate, expensive, and in several of its most fashionable applications slowly killing the people who practiced it. The most prestigious thing a Roman woman could do for her appearance was to make her skin as pale and white as possible. This was not aesthetic preference in isolation. It was a social signal of exactly the same kind we have seen throughout this series. Pale skin meant you did not labour outdoors, did not work in fields or markets, lived a life of indoor leisure attended by servants. White skin was in the Roman economy of appearances a declaration of wealth and status before you'd opened your mouth to say a word. Achieving this whiteness was a production. The first step for wealthy women might involve bathing in donkey milk, the lactic acid in which does genuinely exfoliate and soften skin, which is why this practice popularized by Cleopatra and enthusiastically adopted by the Roman elite is occasionally revived by modern luxury skincare brands. The Empress Poppaea Sabina, wife of Emperor Nero, and renowned as one of the most celebrated beauties of the 1st century, reportedly required an entourage of 500 donkeys wherever she travelled to maintain her supply. Whether or not the number is exact, the principle is documented. She travelled with donkeys for her bath milk. She also created her own overnight face mask of donkey milk mixed with dough, which her attendants applied each evening and removed each morning. After the preparatory treatments came the face whitener itself. The most effective and most fashionable option was Cerussa white lead, ground lead carbonate mixed with various bases to form a cream or powder, applied to the face to create an opaque white finish. The Romans understood that lead was poisonous. Pliny the Elder discusses its toxicity explicitly. The writer Martial mocked women whose thick lead-white makeup would melt in the sun or slide off in the rain, requiring constant reapplication by attendant slaves, which was itself a status signal, since it meant you had attendant slaves available to reapply your face throughout the day. The cosmetic slaves responsible for a wealthy woman's appearance, the cosmetae, were trained specialists, valued members of the household staff, and their skills were considered a form of artistry. For those who found pure white lead too extreme, there were alternatives: chalk powder, white marl, and memorably dried crocodile excrement imported from Egypt at considerable expense, which produced a similar whitening effect, and was apparently popular enough among wealthy Roman women that it featured in multiple contemporary accounts. Ancient Origins notes that crocodile dung was used both as a face whitener and as a component of blush formulations. Wealthy Roman women were paying premium import prices for Egyptian reptile waste and applying it to their faces. I want you to sit with that for just a moment. The blush applied over the white base to suggest the healthy pink glow that white skin alone could not provide was achieved with rose and poppy petals, wine dregs, mulberry juice, and in some cases cinnabar or red lead. Both cinnabar and red lead are poisonous. The Romans knew this. They used them anyway because the colour they produced was correct, and the social statement they made was clear. For the eyes coal made from stibnite antimony sulfide or galena, which is lead sulfide producing a shiny black line that Roman women and some Roman men applied as eyeliner. Saffron imported from Asia Minor for golden eyeshadow. The poet Ovid wrote an entire guide to Roman women's beauty routines called the Medicamina Faciae Feminae, the women's facial cosmetics, in which he provided recipes for skin whitening treatments that contained, among other things, white lead, and noted that the pimple-clearing remedy he recommended would by modern understanding cause slow lead poisoning. This was beauty advice from a celebrated poet, not quackery from a street vendor, and here is the detail I find most genuinely moving about all of this amidst the crocodile dung and the lead cream and the electric ray headache therapy. In the year 2003, archaeologists excavating a Roman temple site on the south bank of the Thames in London opened a small sealed tin canister and found inside it a white cream intact, approximately 2,000 years old, complete with the finger marks of its last user pressed into the surface of the lid. Chemical analysis revealed the cream to be composed of animal fat starch and tin oxide, not lead tin. The cosmetic chemist who made this cream had apparently identified tin as a safer alternative to the standard lead-based whiteners, producing a similar pale finish without the toxicity. Tin from British mines was being used to create a less dangerous face cream. Someone in the 2nd century of the Common Era was trying to make a safer version of the product. The curator Francis Grew of the Museum of London, describing the discovery, noted that this cream, this small tin of 2,000-year-old face moisturizer, still bore the impression of the last person who reached into it to use it. The fingerprints of a Roman woman preserved in cosmetic cream for 2 millennia. I find that detail almost unbearably intimate. Across 2,000 years, across every difference of language and culture and technology and expectation, a person reached into a container of beauty cream and left a mark that is still there. The specific formulation has changed. The fingerprints have not. What Roman medicine and beauty taken together reveal about Roman luxury is something we have been building toward throughout this entire series. Roman luxury was not simply about having more. It was about controlling how the body was seen. Every aspect of the Roman body, its colour, its smell, its health, Its apparent age, its apparent ease was a text that the world around it was expected to read correctly. The pale face said, "I do not labour." The fine toga said, "I have slaves to drape it." The gladiator blood said, "I can afford the physician who prescribes it." The donkey milk bath said, "I have donkeys." The body itself was a luxury object maintained and displayed with the same deliberate intention as a fine domus or a toga of Tyrian purple, and the resources required to maintain it, the skilled cosmetae, the imported ingredients, the personal physicians who had learned their anatomy from gladiator wounds, were themselves proof of status nested inside the display of the body that contained them. Roman civilization built an elaborate, expensive, sometimes toxic, occasionally brilliant system for managing the appearance of the human body. And it did so because in Rome appearances were not vanity. They were communication. They were argument. They were in the most literal sense currency. Which brings us to money itself, because all of this, the food, the baths, the housing, the fashion, the slaves, the entertainments, the medicine, the cosmetics had to be paid for, and the Roman economic system that made wealth possible, the debt networks and credit markets and commercial machinery that turned military conquest into personal fortune, is a story that is every bit as strange and as revealing as anything we have discussed so far. That is exactly where we are heading next. Before Julius Caesar ever led a single soldier across the Rubicon, before he conquered Gaul, before he became the most powerful man in the Roman world, he was something that history tends to gloss over rather quickly. He was spectacularly in debt. Not ordinary debt. Not, "I owe a few friends money" debt. The ancient sources suggest that by the time Caesar was in his 30s, pursuing the political career that Roman aristocracy both demanded and made extremely expensive, he owed somewhere in the range of 25 million denarii. To give you a sense of what that number means, an average Roman legionary soldier earned around 900 denarii a year. Caesar owed the equivalent of roughly 28,000 years of a soldier's pay. He had borrowed from friends, from political allies, from money changers in the forum, from anyone who would extend him credit on the strength of his name and his evident ambition. He was by any rational accounting technically insolvent, and yet, within a decade through the conquest of Gaul, which generated an enormous influx of slaves, plunder and tribute into the Roman economy, Caesar had not only paid off his debts, but emerged as one of the wealthiest men in the Roman world. His rise from debtor to conqueror to effective dictator was financed in its earlier stages entirely on credit. The man who changed the history of the Western world did so in part because Roman financial institutions were sophisticated enough and Roman creditors ambitious enough to extend a loan of almost incomprehensible size to a man whose collateral was essentially his own future. That is the thing about Rome that surprises most people when they first encounter it. The Roman financial system was far more sophisticated than the toga and sandals image suggests. The Argentarii, Rome's private bankers, operated from stalls and shops in and around the Forum, maintaining detailed codex accounts that recorded every transaction, every deposit, every loan. These records were considered legally authoritative and were admissible as evidence in Roman courts. If you and I had done business through the same Argentarius and I disputed what you owed me, the banker's codex settled the question. The financial historian C.T. Barlow, whose doctoral work examined Roman banking in the Republic period, noted that by Cicero's era the word nomen, meaning literally a name in Latin, had come to mean both a debt entry in an account book and the debt itself. Debt in Rome was so fundamental to economic life that the word for it was the same as the word for a person's name. And nomina were not simply passive records of what was owed, they were transferable, If you were owed 1,000,000 sesterces by a reliable debtor, a bonum, nomen a good name, and you needed cash immediately to purchase property, you did not have to wait for your debtor to bring you a bag of coins. You could transfer the claim itself, effectively selling the debt as a financial instrument. Cicero described this practice casually in letters to his financial manager Atticus as a routine transaction of the kind any wealthy Roman of his class would conduct regularly. 2,000 years before modern bond markets, Romans were trading transferable debt claims as a medium of economic exchange. The interest rates on Roman loans varied significantly by risk. Secured loans to reliable borrowers carried annual rates of around 4 to 12%. Short-term commercial loans or loans to higher-risk borrowers commanded much more. Roman law had attempted to cap usury at 12% annually since the reforms of Sulla in 81 before the Common Era, but evasion of these caps was widespread and enforcement was sporadic. For the right borrower, credit was accessible. For the wrong one, the consequences of default were severe. In the early Republic, a debtor who could not repay could be sold into slavery under a system called nexum. Even in the later empire, debt problems could end in the confiscation of everything a person owned. To understand how this financial system produced luxury and eventually threatened to collapse under the weight of it, let me take you to the year 33 of the Common Era. A moment in Roman financial history that has fascinated economists for centuries and that I have been looking forward to talking about since we began this series. By 33 of the Common Era, the Roman Empire was under the rule of Emperor Tiberius, the successor to Augustus. Tiberius was by all ancient accounts an exceptionally frugal man to a degree that created serious economic problems. He had inherited a treasury surplus of 100 million sesterces from Augustus, and rather than spending it on public works games, or the kind of generous distributions that Roman emperors were expected to make, he simply kept it. He accumulated it. By the end of his reign, he had reportedly left his successor Caligula with a surplus of 2.7 billion sesterces. While this sounds prudent, it had the effect of draining liquidity from the broader Roman economy. Less money circulating means less credit available, which means higher interest rates, which means more financial stress throughout the system. Into this already tightened environment came a legal trigger. Julius Caesar had passed a law in 49 before the Common Era, requiring creditors to hold at least 2/3 of their capital invested in Italian land rather than in liquid financial instruments. The law was a wartime emergency measure designed to prevent capital flight from Italy during the Civil War. It was largely ignored in the decades afterward. Nobody really enforced it, and wealthy Romans went on lending money and accumulating financial claims rather than agricultural land because financial instruments were more profitable. Then in 33 of the Common Era, Caesar's old law was suddenly and aggressively revived. The historian Tacitus, writing about 80 years after the crisis, but drawing on sources close to the events, suggests that the revival was partly political in motivation. Senators looking for weapons against their rivals began using the old law to prosecute wealthy creditors for technical violations. The result was immediate and catastrophic. When creditors realized they faced prosecution, unless they rapidly converted their financial holdings into Italian land, they did exactly that they called in their outstanding loans, demanding repayment from debtors who naturally also had to liquidate assets to raise cash. The cascade was rapid. Banks began to fail as borrowers could not repay and depositors withdrew. Land prices crashed as desperate sellers flooded the market. Credit became, in Tacitus's words, unavailable. Rome experienced a full-scale credit crunch, a liquidity crisis that would be recognizable to any student of modern financial history. Tacitus noted somewhat dryly that virtually every senator in Rome was technically in violation of the old law, which makes a certain amount of sense. The entire Roman aristocratic class had built its finances on exactly the kind of credit and investment activity the law prohibited, the financial lifestyle that made possible all the luxury we have been discussing throughout this series, the domus, the fashion, the elaborate dinner parties, the specialty slaves, the imported medicines was built at the top levels of Roman society on a sophisticated credit system that was in significant measure operating outside the technical letter of the law. The resolution of the crisis of 33 is where things become genuinely remarkable from a modern perspective. Tiberius, the frugal emperor who'd been hoarding the treasury surplus for years, intervened. He created a commission of 5 senators authorized to draw on the state treasury, and through this commission he made available 100 million sesterces in interest-free 3-year loans to distressed landowners secured against their property at a 2-to-1 collateral ratio. The loans were distributed through reliable banks to be lent onward. It worked. Land prices stabilized. Credit markets unfroze. The crisis ended. Modern economic historians examining this episode have noted something remarkable about it. What Tiberius essentially executed in 33 of the Common Era bears a striking structural resemblance to what central banks in the 21st century call quantitative easing, the injection of liquidity by a monetary authority to halt a credit freeze and stabilize asset prices. Rome in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, without the vocabulary or the theoretical framework of modern economics, stumbled into an emergency monetary intervention that would not have felt entirely out of place in the policy discussions following the financial crisis of 2008. The parallels are close enough that Tenny Frank, writing his landmark analysis of the Roman crisis of 33 in 1935, did so in the middle of the Great Depression, seeing obvious resonances between the two moments. There is a detail embedded in all of this that I want to sit with for a moment because I think it illuminates something important about the relationship between Roman wealth and Roman luxury that we've been circling throughout this series. The money that paid for all of the conspicuous consumption we've described, the Tyrian purple, the gladiatorial schools, the elaborate dinner parties, the 500 donkeys accompanying an empress, did not at the upper levels of Roman society primarily consist of coins. It consisted of credit, of nomina, of transferable claims on future wealth recorded in bankers' codex books. Roman senators and equestrians were in many cases simultaneously asset-rich and cash-poor in ways that would be entirely familiar to a modern observer who has ever looked at the balance sheet of a heavily leveraged corporation. This creates a somewhat different picture of Roman luxury than the simple one of very rich people spending limitless gold. Roman luxury at its apex was often luxury financed on the assumption of future prosperity, future rents from estates, future returns from tax farming contracts, future tribute from provinces that Rome expected to continue controlling indefinitely. It was a system built on confidence, and confidence, as every financial crisis in history has demonstrated, is an extremely fragile foundation for an edifice as elaborate and expensive as Roman civilization. The publicani, the private tax farming companies of the Republic, organized as what we might now call joint stock companies, with multiple investors and formal charters, were perhaps the most purely financial expression of this dynamic. Companies of equestrians would bid for the right to collect taxes from a Roman province, paying the Roman state up front for this right, and then extracting what they could from the province to earn a profit. Cicero described these companies and their investors in terms that would be recognizable to anyone familiar with modern capital markets. The publicani held shares. Investors bought into and sold out of them based on expected returns. This is joint stock corporate finance operating in Rome in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And here finally is the question that I find genuinely important and genuinely unsettling when I put all of this together. The Roman luxury system as we have traced it through this series was not built primarily on wealth that already existed. It was built on wealth that was being continuously generated by conquest, by slavery, by the extraction of resources from an ever-expanding empire. The moment that expansion slowed, and it did slow beginning in the 2nd century of the Common Era, under Hadrian, who consolidated rather than extended the frontiers, the financial system began to feel the strain. The 3rd century would bring currency debasement, political instability, runaway inflation. The structural economic pressures that contributed to Rome's eventual fragmentation had deep roots in the very financial mechanisms that had made Roman luxury possible in the first place. Rome was in a very real sense a luxury civilization built on perpetual growth, and when perpetual growth became impossible, the luxury became increasingly difficult to sustain. The Romans responded to this pressure in 2 ways that are also thoroughly human and thoroughly familiar. Some responded by doubling down on the display of wealth, by insisting even more loudly on the visible signs of abundance, even as the underlying abundance contracted. Others responded philosophically by questioning whether the wealth and the display had ever been the point. This philosophical response, the Stoic tradition, the concept of otium, the long Roman conversation about the difference between having things and living well is a story in its own right, and it is exactly where we are going next. There is a sentence written by the Roman scholar Pliny the Elder in the 1st century of the Common Era that I have thought about more than almost anything else in this entire series. He was complaining, as Pliny often was, about his fellow Romans and their spending habits, and he wrote this: India, China, and the Arabian Peninsula take 100 million sesterces from our empire every year at a conservative estimate. That is what our luxuries and our women cost us. 100 million sesterces every year, flowing east. To understand what that number means in practical terms, a common Roman soldier earned roughly 800 sesterces annually. 100 million sesterces was equivalent to the annual pay of 125,000 soldiers, and Pliny called it a conservative estimate. This is the part of the Roman luxury story that tends to get overlooked in the popular imagination, because it requires us to think about Rome not as an isolated ancient civilization, but as a node in a genuinely global economic network that stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain all the way to the ports of southern India, to the markets of Sri Lanka, to the silk-producing cities of Han Dynasty China. Rome was not simply a consumer of the Mediterranean world's goods, it was consuming the world. The mechanism that made this possible was something the Romans understood only partially, and it was both the most practical and most poetic thing in the history of ancient commerce. It was the monsoon. For centuries, trade between the Mediterranean and India had moved slowly along coastal routes, hugging the shores of Arabia and the Persian Gulf, a journey of months spent navigating shallow waters and hostile coastlines. Then, sometime around the 1st century before the Common Era, Greek and Egyptian navigators, the pilot Hippolus is credited, in some accounts worked out something that changed everything. The Indian Ocean's winds do not simply blow randomly. They follow a seasonal pattern reversing direction between summer and winter. If you departed from Egypt's Red Sea coast in July, the powerful southwest monsoon would carry you directly across the open ocean to the Malabar coast of India in weeks rather than months. And if you left India in December, the northeast monsoon would carry you home. This discovery compressed the world. What had been a grueling multi-year odyssey became a round trip achievable in a single annual season, and the Romans understood immediately what this meant commercially. By the reign of Augustus, according to the geographer Strabo, who personally visited Egypt during this period, 120 ships were departing from the Red Sea port of Myos Hormos for India every single year. Under Augustus's predecessor, the Ptolemies, only a handful of ships had dared the passage. In a single generation, Rome multiplied the volume of direct India trade by a factor of roughly 6. This was not an accident. Augustus personally invested in opening the route. He removed trade restrictions. He ordered Roman legions to build roads through the Egyptian desert connecting the Nile to the Red Sea ports. He made India profitable. Picture the journey because it is extraordinary. A Roman merchant in the 1st century of the Common Era would begin in Ostia or Puteoli, Rome's main ports, and sail to Alexandria, a voyage of roughly 20 days. From Alexandria, goods travelled up the Nile to Koptos, the commercial hub of Upper Egypt, and then by camel caravan across the eastern desert for 12 days to reach the Red Sea port of Berenice. At Berenice, the caravan's goods were transferred onto ocean-going vessels, large, stout-hulled ships capable of carrying up to 1,000 tons of cargo, armed with mercenary archers against pirates waiting for the turn of the monsoon. In July, with the southwest monsoon filling their sails, these ships crossed the Indian Ocean, not hugging the coast, but sailing directly across open water, out of sight of land for weeks, arriving at the great port city of Muziris on the southwestern Malabar coast, in what is now the Indian state of Kerala. Muziris was by all contemporary accounts extraordinary, a city where Roman, Arab, Greek and Indian merchants mingled, where Tamil traders delivered goods from the interior, where the ships of Rome arrived laden with gold coins, fine glassware, wine, coral and copper, and left filled with the things that Rome could not produce for itself, black pepper. The single most important commodity in the entire Eastern trade, so common on the Roman table that Pliny found it baffling. "What is it," he asked, "about pepper that makes us go to India to get it? Its attraction is only its bite, and for this we go to India." He did not understand why Romans paid gold for pepper when they could simply eat their food unseasoned, but they did. They paid enormous amounts of gold for pepper year after year, and Pliny's complaint about it tells us more about Roman culinary culture than any recipe book. Pepper was not a luxury in the sense of an occasional indulgence. For the wealthy Roman, it was an everyday essential, and the fact that it came from somewhere 12,000 kilometers away at the far edge of the known world made it not more precious, but more ordinary. That is what global trade does. It makes the extraordinary routine. From Muziris, Roman ships also carried cinnamon and cassia from Sri Lanka, and China ginger, cardamom, fine cotton textiles, ivory, tortoiseshell, precious and semi-precious stones, diamonds, rubies, sapphires, emeralds from the mines of India, and Chinese silk, which had travelled overland from China to India before being loaded onto Roman ships. The round trip from Italy to India and back took roughly a year. The profit margins, according to Pliny, were staggering. Goods purchased in India could be sold in Rome for up to 100 times the purchase price, even after the Roman government took its 25% import duty at Alexandria. And the silk. We must talk about the silk. Rome named China Ceres the Kingdom of Silk, because silk was the first thing most Romans knew about China, and for many the only thing that mattered. Chinese silk arrived in Rome through a chain of intermediaries so long that most Romans had no accurate understanding of where it actually came from or how it was made. The most widespread Roman belief was that silk was combed from the leaves of trees, a kind of vegetable fibre. Seneca and Virgil both repeated this understanding. Pliny the Elder characteristically was better informed. He wrote that silk came from the bombyx, which is simply a transliteration of the Greek word for silkworm, and that they weave webs like spiders that become a luxurious clothing material for women. Pliny got it roughly right. Most of his contemporaries did not. What they did know was that silk felt unlike anything else. It was lighter than linen, cooler than wool, and draped with a liquid quality that wool and cotton could not approach. And it was translucent thin silk showed the outline of the body beneath it in ways that Roman moralists found scandalous. Seneca complained about women wearing silk because it left nothing more to the imagination than if she were naked. The Roman Senate periodically issued proclamations attempting to restrict or ban silk, largely on moral grounds. The wearing of such revealing fabric was considered inappropriate, especially for men, but these proclamations were almost entirely unsuccessful. The demand was too strong. The status signal was too clear. Silk, precisely because it came from the far edge of the world and cost a fortune, and scandalized the moralists, was exactly the kind of thing wealthy Romans wanted, and they paid for it in gold. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices from the year 301 of the Common Era set 1 kilogram of raw silk at 4,000 gold coins. We mentioned this earlier in the context of Tyrian purple, but it is worth revisiting here. At that price, silk was worth more per kilogram than gold itself. Rome was exporting its gold reserves to the eastern edges of the known world in exchange for a fabric. Pliny's 100 million sesterces a year draining east was largely silk and spices, and the Roman government was by the later empire genuinely alarmed by the pace of gold loss to eastern trade. It was one of the factors that contributed to the economic pressures of the later imperial period, but the trade was not one-directional, and that is a dimension of this story that tends to get lost when we focus only on what Rome was importing. Roman glass, the distinctive soda-lime glass produced in workshops in Rome, Syria and Egypt, was itself a prestige commodity in the East. Archaeologists excavating burial mounds in China, Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines have found Roman glassware among the most treasured possessions of the Asian elite. Roman coins, gold aurae, bearing the portraits of emperors from Augustus through the later empire have been found in enormous hoards across southern India. Tamil literary sources, the Sangam poems of the first centuries of the Common Era, describe Roman ships arriving at Indian ports, laden with gold to be exchanged for pepper, and refer to the Romans as Yavanas, the Indian term for Western foreigners that had originally applied to Greeks and was extended to Romans as the dominant Western power. Inscriptions in Tamil Greek Latin and several South Asian scripts have been found at the excavated site of Myos Hormos, suggesting a genuinely multicultural trading community. And in Berenice, the other major Red Sea port, archaeologists have found Indian black peppercorns in the excavated ruins, Indonesian cloves that had travelled through India to reach Egypt, teak planks from Indian forests, and perhaps most movingly, a small marble statue of the Buddha found in the forecourt of a temple dedicated to the Egyptian goddess Isis, suggesting the presence of Buddhist merchants from India in an Egyptian port city worshipping beside Roman merchants honouring an Egyptian deity. The first century of the Common Era was in some ways we rarely acknowledge already a world where religions and cultures were moving along trade routes in both directions. There is a detail from the archaeology of this trade that I find quietly devastating in how it reframes the entire history. In 166 of the Common Era, while Marcus Aurelius, whom Epictetus's philosophy had influenced, was serving as Emperor of Rome, the first documented Roman diplomatic mission reached the Han Dynasty court of China. The embassy presented gifts and requested trade relations. The Chinese records describe the emissaries as coming from Dakin, their name for the Roman Empire, and list the gifts they brought: ivory, rhinoceros horn, and tortoise shell. The Chinese records note with polite understatement that these were not particularly impressive gifts, suggesting the Chinese had been expecting something more valuable from the Empire of the West. The Romans, for their part, had sent emissaries to China without apparently bringing very much that China wanted. China already had ivory and rhinoceros horn. China had silk. What China wanted from Rome, it turned out, was not luxury goods, but rather access to the Western markets that Rome controlled. And in this one small diplomatic moment, the embassy that arrived with the wrong gifts, you can see the entire structure of the Roman luxury trade from the Chinese perspective. Rome was the hungry empire, consuming everything the East could produce, paying in gold, and not entirely understanding the terms of the exchange it was participating in. For all the genius of Roman engineering and law and philosophy, for all the architectural wonders we've traced through this series, the Roman relationship to global trade reveals something about the empire's deeper character. Rome was at its heart a consuming civilization. It consumed the labor of slaves, the harvests of conquered provinces, the wild animals of Africa and Asia, and the luxury goods of civilizations it barely understood, importing pepper from India, silk from China, amber from the Baltic coast, frankincense from Arabia, ivory from sub-Saharan Africa, weaving all of these distant exotic things into the texture of everyday Roman life among the wealthy. And this consumption was itself a form of power, the ability to place goods from the far edge of the known world on your dinner table, to wear silk from a country you could not accurately name, to burn frankincense from a coast your sailors had barely mapped. This was Rome communicating something to anyone who watched. We are connected to the whole world. The whole world in some sense works for us. But connection and dependence have a complicated relationship, as every empire eventually discovers. The 100 million sesterces flowing east every year was not simply an expense. It was a structural vulnerability. The gold was leaving. The silk kept coming. And the question of what happens to a civilization that has organized its entire system of luxury, status, and desire around the assumption of endless supply, that question was beginning in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era to press itself on the attention of the people running the empire, which brings us finally to the philosophy that the Romans built to make sense of all of this. The idea of otium. The argument that the purpose of wealth was not display but reflection, not the accumulation of silk and pepper, but the cultivation of the self. The Stoics had been making this argument for centuries, while their adherents simultaneously purchased silk and hired cosmetae, and owned thousands of slaves. And the tension between the philosophy of contentment and the practice of consumption is the central paradox of Roman luxury, the one we've been building toward all along. That contradiction, and what it finally meant for the empire, is where we are going next. Consider this scene. The year is roughly 58 of the Common Era. In Rome, one of the most powerful men in the empire sits at his writing desk and composes a letter to his friend Lucilius. In the letter he describes the resort town of Baiae, a stretch of volcanic coastline on the Bay of Naples, where the wealthy of Rome kept their holiday villas, where hot springs and warm sea baths made it the most fashionable retreat in the Mediterranean world. He writes to Lucilius that Baiae is a place to be avoided. That luxury has claimed it as its exclusive resort. That to witness people wandering drunk along the beach, the riotous revelling of sailing parties, the sound of music from pleasure boats drifting across the water, all of it is a kind of corruption that the serious person should flee. This letter is remarkable for many reasons, but the one that matters most is this. The man writing it owned a villa at Baiae. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca. He was one of the wealthiest individuals in the Roman Empire, with properties at Baiae, at Nomentum and Alban Villa, and estates in Egypt. His personal fortune, according to his political enemies, and he had many, amounted to 300 million sesterces. In a society where a senator needed to demonstrate assets of 1,000,000 sesterces simply to stand for office, Seneca was 300 times over that threshold. He was also simultaneously the most eloquent voice in the Roman world, arguing that wealth was unimportant, that external things could not touch the inner freedom of the wise person, and that the purpose of life was not accumulation but reflection. He was, in other words, the most interesting hypocrite in the history of Western philosophy, and he knew it. To understand what Seneca was doing and why it matters, we need to understand the philosophical concept that structured the Roman relationship to luxury more than any other. The concept was otium. Otium is a Latin word that does not translate easily into modern English because we do not have a precise equivalent for what it meant to Romans. The closest approximation is something like meaningful leisure, not idleness, not vacation, not simply the absence of work, but a particular quality of time devoted to philosophy writing, contemplation, friendship, and the cultivation of the inner self. Its opposite was negotium business public duty, the demanding and often exhausting activity of Roman civic life. The Roman upper class was expected to move between these two states, negotium in the city conducting the business of empire, otium at the country villa reading thinking, writing letters. This sounds on its surface like a very pleasant arrangement, and for many Romans it was. But beneath its surface lay a question that Roman philosophy never fully resolved. What is the relationship between genuine inner freedom and the material conditions required to pursue it? If otium requires a villa, and a villa requires wealth, and wealth requires the kind of participation in Roman political and economic life that produces moral compromise, then is otium itself a form of luxury? And if it is, can you pursue it honestly, while simultaneously preaching the unimportance of luxury? This was Seneca's problem. It was also in different forms the problem of nearly every Roman philosopher who tried to argue against the culture of consumption while living comfortably within it. Seneca's response to the accusation of hypocrisy was characteristically brilliant and not entirely satisfying. In his treatise De Vita Beata on the Happy Life, written around the year 58, precisely when public attacks on his wealth were at their most pointed, he argued that wealth is neither good nor bad in itself. It is simply a material condition. The wise person can possess wealth without being possessed by it. The Stoic sage is not diminished by having money any more than a pilot is made a worse sailor by having a fine ship. What matters is the internal disposition, the freedom from anxiety, from attachment, from the fear of loss, not the external circumstances. It is a coherent argument. It is also, if we are honest, exactly the kind of argument that a very wealthy person would find extremely convenient. The philosopher Publius Suilius Rufus, who mounted the public attacks on Seneca in the year 58, made this point with some force. He asked in essence, if wealth is morally neutral, why spend so much energy persuading everyone that it does not matter? And if it does not matter, why pursue 300 million sesterces worth of it? Seneca had Suilius prosecuted, half his estate confiscated and sent into exile, which resolved the debate in practical terms, if not philosophical ones. What I find genuinely moving about Seneca, though, and this is perhaps an unfashionable view, is that he was not merely a hypocrite in the simple sense. He was something more interesting, a person who understood the gap between his ideals and his life with complete clarity and kept trying to close it anyway. His letters to Lucilius, 124 of them written in the final years of his life, when he had retreated from political power and was trying to think clearly before the death he suspected was coming. These letters are not the work of a man performing virtue. They are the work of a man genuinely wrestling with what virtue costs and what it asks, and why it is so difficult to sustain in a world that keeps offering you a very nice villa by the sea. In letter 1, the very first letter in the collection, Seneca writes to Lucilius, "Reclaim yourself." He goes on to argue that time is the one thing no one can give back, and that most people spend it carelessly on things that do not matter, because they cannot see clearly what does. "It is not that we have a short time to live," he writes in a different work, "but that we waste much of it. And the waste he has in mind is not leisure itself. It is the wrong kind of leisure, the buy-eye kind, the banquet kind, the conspicuous consumption kind. Otium, as a genuine practice of self-examination, he argues, is the most important thing a person can do with their time. He simply argues this while owning several estates. Now, Horace. If Seneca represents the tortured, self-aware contradiction at the heart of Roman luxury philosophy, the poet Quintus Horatius Flaccus represents something else entirely, the person who genuinely seems to have believed what he wrote, and to have organized his life around it, and to have been honestly content. Horace was born in 65 before the Common Era in Venusia, a small town in southern Italy, the son of a freed slave who worked as a tax collector. His father, understanding that education was his son's only path upward, spent his modest income sending Horace to Rome for schooling and then to Athens for philosophy. Horace eventually fought on the wrong side of a civil war, lost, came home, got a government job copying documents, and started writing poetry. His poetry was so good that the statesman Maecenas, the greatest cultural patron in Roman history, a close confidant of Augustus, became his friend and gave him a Sabine farm in the hills northeast of Rome. The Sabine farm changed everything. It was not a grand estate. It was a working agricultural property of moderate size with a spring, some woodland, a farmhouse. Horace described it with a particularity and affection that reads as entirely unperformed: the sound of the spring in summer, the shade of the trees, the simple meals, the quiet. And in his odes poems that are among the finest ever written in any language, he returned again and again to the theme that this modest specific place was where he wanted to be, and that it was enough. His phrase for the principle he was celebrating was aurea mediocritas, the golden mean, or the golden middle way. From his Odes Book 2, whoever loves the golden mean is safe from the filth of a dilapidated hovel, and is prudently free from an enviable palace. Neither poverty nor wealth, neither extreme ambition nor complete withdrawal. The moderate, self-sufficient, philosophically examined life as the actual path to contentment, not as a compromise between what you want and what you can afford, but as the genuine realization that wanting the right amount of the right things is itself the article. Horace's version of this philosophy is not Stoic in its technical framework. He drew on Epicureanism as much as Stoicism, and the Epicurean insight that pleasure should be modest, specific and sustainable, rather than extravagant, novel and anxiety-producing, runs through his poetry like a thread. His Carpe Diem seize the day from Odes Book 1 is often misread as a call to hedonism. What Horace actually means is almost the opposite. Do not waste this particular day pursuing things you cannot have, or which will not satisfy you when you get them. The wine, the fire, the friend, the poem, these specific present pleasures fully attended to are enough. They are more than enough. Here is what strikes me every time I come back to Horace. He is one of very few people in Roman literary history who does not seem to be performing his philosophy for an audience. Seneca is always slightly performing. Cicero is always performing. Marcus Aurelius, who wrote his meditations in Greek, as private notes to himself with no intention of publication, wrestling with his own failures to live up to what he knew was right, is not performing, but his life as emperor made pure Stoic practice nearly impossible. Horace on his small farm with his spring and his simple meals and his wine and his poems appears to have actually gotten there. He wanted what he had, And what he had was enough. The tension between Seneca's wealth and his philosophy, between Horace's contentment and the impossibility of replicating his specific circumstance for most Romans, between the Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, commanding an army worth millions while writing. That external things cannot touch the inner self, this tension was not incidental to Roman philosophy. It was its defining condition. Roman Stoicism emerged and flourished in the very centuries when Roman luxury was at its peak. The first and second centuries of the Common Era, when the feasting culture we traced in Part 2 was at its most extravagant, when Tyrian purple was worth more than gold, when 120 ships a year were sailing to India for pepper and silk, are also exactly the centuries when Seneca and Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius were writing with the greatest urgency about the irrelevance of all external things to human happiness. That is not a coincidence. That is a civilization in dialogue with itself. The luxury and the philosophy that critiqued it were products of the same world addressed to the same people, trying to answer the same question from opposite directions. If you have everything, food comfort, beauty entertainment, servants, silk spices from the other side of the earth, why does it still not feel like enough? Seneca's answer in his clearest moments was that it never will. Not because there is something wrong with you, but because the appetite for external things is structurally insatiable. You satisfy one desire and a new one appears. You reach the income level you thought would make you comfortable, and discover the threshold has moved. You buy the villa and immediately begin worrying about keeping it. The anxiety is not cured by more. The only thing that cures it is a different relationship to wanting, and that is what Stoicism at its core is trying to teach. Whether Seneca managed to learn it himself, whether anyone fully manages it, is a separate question. What matters is that he kept trying. What matters is that he wrote the attempt down, and what matters for our purposes in this series is that these philosophical texts survive as evidence that the Romans who consumed the most were also simultaneously the Romans most urgently questioning what consumption was actually for. Here is a thought I would like to leave you with before we move to the final chapter of this story. Marcus Aurelius, emperor, Stoic philosopher, commander of the greatest military force in the ancient world, wrote in his private notes the text we now call Meditations. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. He wrote this while commanding armies, managing the political complexities of imperial succession, presiding over banquets of the kind we described in the early parts of this series. He was writing it to himself, as a reminder, because he needed reminding. That is perhaps the most human thing about Roman luxury in the end. Not the excess which was real, not the ostentation which was calculated, but the fact that even in the middle of it, at the very highest levels of Roman power and wealth and material abundance, there were people writing notes to themselves in the middle of the night trying to remember that none of it was the point. Which brings us finally to the last chapter. Because for all the philosophy, for all the warnings, for all the voices that said this path leads nowhere, the Roman appetite for luxury did not slow down. It accelerated. And what happened at the far end of that acceleration, what it looked like when excess finally ceased to be a style and became a system, when the display of luxury consumed the capacity to maintain the civilization that had produced it, that is the story we have been building toward for this entire series. And it begins with a single name that even 2,000 years later still functions as a synonym for unhinged, spectacular, unbelievable excess. We're going there right now. The year is 218 of the Common Era. Somewhere in the Syrian city of Emesa, a 14-year-old boy has just been declared Emperor of Rome. His birth name was Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus. He'd grown up as a high priest of the Syrian sun god, Elagabal performing rituals at the temple in robes of silk and gold, dancing around altars while crowds gathered to watch his beauty and the strangeness of the ceremony. When the reigning emperor was killed, his ambitious grandmother Julia Mesa spread the rumor that her grandson was the illegitimate son of the previous emperor Caracalla, the bloodline that the legions respected. The legions believed it, or at least they acted as though they did. Either way, a teenage priest from Syria found himself almost overnight in possession of the most powerful office in the Western world. He took the imperial name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus. He became known to history as Elagabalus, and what followed was 4 years that the Romans themselves could barely put into words. The historian Aelius Lampridius, whose account of Elagabalus in the Augustan history is one of our primary sources, though modern scholars estimate only about a quarter of it is strictly reliable, opens his biography with a remarkable admission. He writes that he had hoped never to record this reign at all, wishing that it might not be known that such a person was ever Emperor of Rome. That opening line tells us something important even before a single event is described. Not shock, not outrage, something closer to exhaustion. As though the author has spent considerable effort deciding whether the story deserves to be told, and has concluded reluctantly that it does. What Elagabalus did was not simply engage in excess. Rome had emperors who were brutal. It had emperors who were extravagant. It had emperors who were corrupt, incompetent, dangerously cruel. What made Elagabalus different? What made him into the figure that still functions 2,000 years later as the ultimate symbol of Roman decadence was that he seemed genuinely uninterested in the performance of power altogether. His predecessors, however badly they behaved, at least maintained the fiction that they were running an empire. Elagabalus apparently could not be bothered with the fiction. He arrived in Rome, and his first order of business was not to attend the Senate or review the military situation on the frontiers. His first act was to construct a temple on the Palatine Hill to house his sun god, a large black conical meteorite from Emesa, and to require the Roman religious establishment, including the ancient institutions of the Vestal Virgins and the priests of Jupiter, to subordinate their rites to the new deity. He then organized a summer procession for the sacred stone in which it was placed on a chariot drawn by 6 enormous white horses, the chariot decorated in gold, and Elagabalus himself walked backward in front of it, so that he could face his god at all times, which required him to be guided by attendants to prevent him from tripping. The entire Roman Senate was required to walk alongside. The Senate, which had survived a century of increasingly erratic emperors, found this particular ritual arrangement difficult. The banquets. We must discuss the banquets. According to the sources, an invitation to dine with Elagabalus was an experience of considerable ambiguity. You might be served up to 22 courses featuring camel heels, peacock tongues, and the brains of 600 ostriches at a single sitting. You might find your dish contained pearls mixed into rice or gold coins stirred through your peas, because Elagabalus, according to the Augustan history, enjoyed having the prices of the food exaggerated to his guests as an appetizer before they actually ate it. He held colour-themed banquets throughout each summer, a green banquet one day, an iridescent one the next, then blue, then scarlet, cycling through the spectrum with menus matched to the colour scheme. He would offer prizes to dinner guests who invented new and pleasing sauces, the prize being a garment of silk, then still a rarity, and if the sauce did not please him, the inventor was required to keep eating it until they produced a better one. But the detail that has survived longest in the popular imagination, the detail that the Victorian painter Lawrence Alma Tadema immortalized in his 1888 oil painting, now considered one of the great images of Roman decadence, is this: Elagabalus had a banqueting room with a reversible ceiling, and on at least one occasion he caused so many rose petals to cascade down from it onto his dinner guests that several of them, unable to crawl to the surface through the depth of flowers, were smothered to death. The Latin source says simply he buried his guests in violets and other flowers so that some expired when they could not crawl out to the top. Now, I want to pause here and be honest with you, because this is the point in the series where the most extraordinary stories deserve the most careful examination. Modern historians estimate that roughly a quarter of the Augustan history's account of Elagabalus is reliable. The biographies were written decades after his death by authors whose identities are disputed for audiences that had no particular interest in charitable treatment of an emperor whose dynasty had been erased from official memory. The rose petal story may be true, it may be embellished, it may be an invention designed to make a point about the kind of rule the new dynasty was rejecting when it replaced him. What is not in dispute is that Elagabalus was genuinely unpopular, not because of sexual excess or religious strangeness, which the Roman elite could tolerate as long as governance continued, but because governance did not continue. He appointed his lovers and favourites to positions of state. He ignored military matters during a period when the frontiers required attention. He spent on spectacle while the machinery of the empire required investment. He was in the political language of the day, not present to the serious business of ruling. The Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard whose loyalty had kept several previous emperors alive through crises, eventually decided they had had enough. In March of 222 of the Common Era, Elagabalus and his mother were killed, and their bodies dragged through the streets of Rome to the Tiber where they were thrown in. He was 18 years old. His 4-year reign had cost the treasury enormous sums, and achieved essentially nothing of administrative value. His successor, Alexander Severus, immediately reversed almost all of his cousin's innovations and set about the business of running an empire with sufficient competence that historians later remembered him as something approaching a model of good governance. The sun god went back to Syria. The Senate was restored to a semblance of dignity. The memorable banquets ended, and now we reach the question that this entire series has been building toward, and I want to answer it carefully because the easy answer is not the right one. Did luxury destroy Rome? The popular version of Roman history says yes. It is an old story told in some form by Roman moralists themselves that the empire that had conquered the world through discipline and simplicity was undone by the wealth it accumulated that Tyrian purple and peacock tongues and silk from China, and rose-petal banquets and lead-lined wine and crocodile dung face cream altogether constituted a kind of civilizational rot, a softening of the virtue that had built the thing in the first place. Juvenal believed it. Pliny believed it. Edward Gibbon, writing his monumental History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire between 1776 and 1788, built his entire framework around a version of it, that material prosperity ripened the principles of decay, that luxury was both symptom and cause of the moral decline that preceded the political collapse. It is a satisfying story. It is the kind of story that feels true because it has the shape of a moral, because it suggests that excess carries within it the seeds of its own punishment, that civilizations like individuals can be undone by having too much. Modern historians are considerably more skeptical. The Western Roman Empire did not fall because of peacock tongues. It fell because of a convergence of genuinely complex structural forces, military pressure from Germanic peoples who had themselves been displaced by the movement of the Huns from Central Asia. The chronic fiscal strain of maintaining an enormous frontier defence on tax revenues that kept shrinking as agricultural land was disrupted by invasion. a 3rd century crisis between 235 and 284 of the Common Era, during which at least 26 men claimed the imperial throne, and almost all of them were killed, creating a generation of political and economic instability from which the Western Empire never fully recovered. The administrative decision to split the empire, which strengthened the East, but left the West more vulnerable. And an Antonine plague in the 2nd century, followed by the plague of Cyprian in the 3rd, that killed enormous portions of the population on which the agricultural and military economy depended. None of these causes is too many rose petals. None of them is Tyrian purple or Indian pepper, or the cost of Papia Sabina's donkeys. The luxury, extraordinary, excessive, sometimes surreal as it was not the engine of Roman decline. It was the surface. What was happening underneath was structural, political, and demographic. But, and this is the part of the argument I find genuinely interesting, the moralists were not entirely wrong either, just wrong about the mechanism. The conspicuous luxury of the imperial period was not the cause of Rome's structural problems, but it was a very accurate indicator of them. The wealth that funded the peacock tongues, and the silk, and the 100 million sesterces Eastern trade deficit was produced by a system conquest tribute slavery, provincial extraction, that was simultaneously creating the conditions of its own fragility. The more the empire relied on military expansion for revenue, the more it needed military expansion, until the frontiers reached the point where further expansion was not possible, and the economics of the system began to run in reverse. The luxury did not cause this, but the luxury was funded by it, and when you look at the luxury, you're looking at exactly what was at stake. Here is what I think this series has actually been about and why I wanted to tell it the way I did. Every single thing we have examined over these 12 parts, the feasts, the architecture, the water system, the fashion, the slavery, the entertainment, the medicine, the cosmetics, the global trade, the philosophy of contentment that flourished alongside the philosophy of excess, and the final spectacular implosion of Elagabalus. Every one of these things is a window into how a civilization understood itself, what it valued, what it feared, what it was trying to communicate about power, beauty, pleasure, and the human need to be seen. Roman luxury was not simple vanity, though there was plenty of that. It was a language, a system of signals, a set of arguments about who deserved what, who was capable of what, and what the good life looked like when you had the resources to pursue it, and the fact that this system was riddled with contradictions, that the philosophers who condemned it also participated in it, that the slaves who were props in the display of status were also human beings, whose inner lives Seneca and Epictetus tried to honour, that the gold-draining East to India was both the proof of Roman power and a quiet measure of Roman dependency. These contradictions are not failures of the civilization. They are its character. They are what makes it interesting. 2,000 years have passed. The Roman Empire is gone. The Palatine Hill where Elagabalus built his temple and Nero built his palace is open to tourists. The warehouses of Ostia, where Indian pepper and Chinese silk and Baltic amber were unloaded and stored, are archaeological sites. The Circus Maximus, where 150,000 people once gathered to watch chariots race in the name of a colour, is a public park. And we still talk about them, not because they were superior to us, or because we should imitate them, or because their system of values was one we should adopt, but because they were recognisably us, struggling with the same questions that have not become any easier in 2,000 years. What is luxury for? What do you owe the people your prosperity depends on? How much is enough? When does the display of what you have become a substitute for understanding what you are? And what remains after the feasting and the silk and the spectacle and the philosophy when the guests have all gone home? The Romans asked these questions loudly and in public. They wrote their answers down. They built in stone. They left fingerprints in face cream sealed in tin for 2,000 years. And they left us a mirror if we choose to look into it. Thank you for staying with this series all the way to the end. 12 parts is a long time to spend with one civilization, and the fact that you are still here tells me something about why these stories matter, not as ancient history, but as ongoing conversation. Rome is not over. The questions it raised are not settled. And if anything in this series made you stop and think or made you look at your own life slightly differently, then that is exactly what it was meant to do. The next time we sit down together, we will be travelling somewhere else entirely, a different civilization, a different set of questions, a different set of answers that are really the same questions in different clothes. History does not repeat, as the saying almost goes, but it does rhyme. And the rhymes, when you hear them clearly, are some of the most extraordinary music in the world. Stay with us. The next story is waiting.